Welcome to the Science of Sports Performance, where we discuss the real science of nutrition and exercise, helping you train smarter, fuel better, and perform at your very best. My name is Ben Pressler, and I'm currently an undergraduate student majoring in both nutritional and exercise sciences at Brigham Young University. I'm pursuing my PhD with the goal of becoming a professor of sports nutrition. Now, I understand that my current qualifications might not be quite up to par with what you're used to from many other podcasts, but I assure you that I am committed to discovering genuine scientific principle in these areas. And I assure you that the information I share with you in this podcast will be as accurate, as research-backed, and as up-to-date as possible. I also am an athlete myself, and if any of the tools I were to share with you are incorrect, I do hope to know about it, both so that I can correctly inform you all in my audience, but also so that I have the best tools for my own performance. I encourage you to scrutinize all the things that I say and become a scientist of yourself. Now, welcome to episode 2, everybody. I feel like I owe you all an apology in the delay of getting this second episode out. I got a pretty bad cold a few weeks ago that even after I started feeling better, I had this sore throat that lasted for just weeks, which was miserable. And then last week, when I finally sat down to record this episode 2, my apartment complex was redoing the roof. Of course, I live on the top floor, so there's just a lot of loud banging on my roof that I figured you guys didn't want to listen to the entire time. All that aside, you guys did not come to listen to my excuses about why this episode is coming out so late. You came to learn about nutrition, and for that, I thank you. Today in episode 2, we are going to be talking about how to manipulate body composition. And we're going to be talking about the two main aspects of that. The first one being how to lose body fat or adipose tissue. And the second one being how to increase lean muscle mass on your frame. Both of those things, of course, will affect your body composition, hopefully in meaningful and desirable ways. Now, before we get into all of the science of that, I wanted to share some statistics from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in the United States. Did you know, according to the CDC, that 40% of the U.S. population, adult population, is considered to be obese, and 74% of the United States adult population is considered to be overweight or obese? Did you know that in the United States, 21% of children are considered to be overweight? And this number in children is a 10 times increase in the last 50 years, since the year 1975. Now, being overweight and obese is not just a cosmetic issue, as some people will often view it as, but it is often, it is not often, it does go hand in hand with something called metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is characterized by an increase in blood pressure, an increase in blood cholesterol levels and lipid levels, being insulin resistant, and all of these things increase a person's risk dramatically of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, stroke, cancer, and a whole host of chronic diseases that can affect not just how long you live, but how well you live, especially in the very end of your life. Now, did you know that approximately 80% of chronic diseases, so that is 4 out of 5 cases of chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease, stroke, and cancer, could have been prevented altogether, or at the very least delayed by lifestyle choices? In fact, it is estimated that 95%, almost all cases of type 2 diabetes could have been prevented altogether through lifestyle changes. I share all of this with you so you guys will understand that manipulating body composition is not simply about the way you look. It's not just for bodybuilders and people who want to take their shirt off at the beach. It really is about health. On the flip side of that, as we're going to be talking as well about gaining muscle is not just for athletes. It's not just for bodybuilders or powerlifters. It is something that I believe very strongly everyone should be interested in. First of all, it can help prevent against things like type 2 diabetes because you have a greater amount of tissue for the nutrients and the glucose in your blood to be delivered to, delaying the resistance of your cells becoming resistant to the signals from insulin that cause type 2 diabetes. As well as, I like to say that everyone at some point in their life will become a power lifter. For those of you who might not be familiar, power lifter is a type of athlete who competes in 3 exercises: the squat, the deadlift, and the bench press, and simply tries to get all 3 of these exercises to be as strong as possible. And I believe everyone will become a power lifter at some point in their life. And usually that means in your old age. It's actually very common for one of the reasons people will be admitted into nursing homes or long-term care facilities is because they have lost the muscle and the strength to be able to walk around, to sit down and stand up off of the toilet and things like that. And perhaps some of you guys remember from last episode, or because you know me personally, that I work as an EMT and a firefighter. And it is very common as an EMT especially to respond on calls to people who are afflicted with chronic disease. Many people think, including myself when I was in my EMT class, that most of what I'd be doing would be responding to traumatic accidents like falls and car crashes and fixing medical problems like that. However, that's really not the case, especially in the United States. I'm not sure about other countries, but in the United States and in where I live, where I work, it is very, very common for the majority of calls that you go on to be primarily elder or at least middle-aged people who are suffering from chronic disease. People who have not taken good care of themselves throughout their life and now are having adverse medical reactions, whether that's COPD and difficulty breathing, whether that is a heart attack or a stroke, or whether that's because somebody fell and they broke a hip or a leg, whether that means somebody needs a lift assist because they're not strong enough or capable enough, or sometimes just because they're too heavy to get themselves back up off the ground and into their bed or into their chair or wherever they need to be. These things are very, very, very common, especially in the United States. And for these reasons, these principles that I'll be sharing about manipulating body composition are not unique to athletes. Now, they can be very, very beneficial to athletes, especially athletes like runners, track and field athletes. For example, if you simply reduce your body weight by losing adipose tissue, and your muscular power in your legs primarily stays the same, then your power to weight ratio and your strength to weight ratio will improve and you'll become a faster athlete. And this same idea can apply to baseball players, basketball players, football players, all sorts of athletes, as well as it is beneficial to bodybuilders for the presentation of their physique on a stage. It is beneficial to power lifters because they compete in weight class divisions as well as in combat sports. It is also, I'm not super familiar with combat sports, but I believe in pretty much all combat sports, you compete in a weight class. So that way, it's fair. You weigh the same as your opponent. And so it's more optimal to fight in a lower weight class, which could be accomplished by manipulating your body composition, losing body fat. With all that aside, I hope you all understand how the information that I'm going to share with you today will be applicable to you, to your situation. In fact, if you've gotten to this point and you don't think that this podcast is applicable to you, I would invite you to re-listen to everything I've said up until now, because I promise that the information I'm about to share with you will. Now, with that all aside, the first thing that I want to talk about today in terms of manipulating body composition is fat loss. Again, this episode is going to be divided in half. The first half will be talking about fat loss. The second half will be talking about how to increase muscle size. That is called hypertrophy. We'll get into that later. And the first thing that I wanted to talk about as we discuss fat loss is the idea of a calorie. Now, perhaps if you are familiar with some of the things going around in the health and fitness sphere, You will know that there are a lot of arguments against calories. And so I really wanted to discuss what a calorie is, how we burn them, how we eat them, why they matter, and help you understand what really is going on as we lose body fat tissue. Now, a calorie, of course, in the audio sphere, I need to kind of describe everything out. You will often see the word calorie written with either a lowercase letter C or an uppercase letter C. Now we're going to talk first about the lowercase calorie. So calorie with a lowercase c. A calorie, in this sense, is the amount of energy that is required to raise the temperature of 1 gram or 1 cubic centimeter of water by 1 degree Celsius. Again, 1 calorie is the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. That is a calorie with a little c. Now, food calories, so when you look on the back of a food label and it says a certain food has perhaps 100 calories, those food calories are actually calories with a capital, a big letter C. And that can also be written as a kilocalorie or a kcal. Those are both very common. And a food calorie is simply 1,000, meaning, as I described, a kilocalorie. It is 1,000 calories of a little c. So that would be the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of 1,000 grams of water by 1 degree Celsius. Now, as I described that, perhaps some of you guys have learned that before in a class you might have taken in high school or college. Those who are more active in the fitness and athlete sphere perhaps already know that. But I say that to help you understand that a calorie is a unit of energy. It's a unit of heat change, right? And that's all it is. It is a unit that we use to measure things. And in the argument against calories, you will often hear people say things like, oh, well, calories don't matter. Not all calories are created equal. Not all calories are the same. And this could technically be considered as true in a relative sense, but calories are just a measurement. They're just a measurement. They're not a molecule. They're not a substance that we consume. It's a measurement of energy. So, for example, 1 calorie is a unit in the same way that 1 inch on a ruler is a measurement, in the same way that 1 second on a clock is a measurement. And, you could say not all seconds on the clock are created equal, but of course they are, literally. It's just that, perhaps time flies, more fast than when you are hanging out with a good friend or your partner, and time goes by very slowly when you're waiting in a doctor's office or when you're having a long day at work. Of course, the seconds are the exact same, but then relative, they may feel a little different. And that's the same way with calories, 200 calories of Twinkies or candy often goes by very, very fast, whereas that same amount of calories of vegetables, of broccoli, takes a lot longer to eat and helps you feel a lot more full. The calories are the same, but they just kind of change your perception about how you feel about those calories. Now, to kind of expand on this idea of calories don't matter, they do. Calories definitely matter. Calories are kind of a measure of the chemical energy within the carbons of a certain food. And that is really what we can simplify it down to. Because again, like I said, I think a lot of people misunderstand calories to think that it is some sort of a molecule or substance that we can ingest and then literally burn in our bodies, because that is a term commonly used, is to burn calories. But that's not the case. It's a measure of energy. But what is a substance that we ingest and release is carbons, the amount of carbons in a particular food. So for example, hopefully we all remember this equation from perhaps even middle school. We've learned this, the equation for photosynthesis. When a plant uses sunlight energy to create its own food, it brings in 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of water. And then with that sunlight energy is able to convert those molecules into 1 molecule of glucose as well as 6 molecules of oxygen. That's why plants are so beneficial, is because they take the carbon dioxide that builds up in our atmosphere and releases oxygen back to us, which is what we want for our fuel. Now, that equation for photosynthesis, of course, it's very simplified, but it is the exact reverse of cellular respiration, which is the process, the chemical process that we and all other animals use to extract energy from our food. So in our bodies, 1 molecule of glucose together with 6 molecules of oxygen will be converted into some energy for our body to use, as well as 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 1 molecule of water. The energy stored within those carbon bonds are what constitute calories. And we can, in fact, measure the amount of calories burned and the amount of energy we're using by tracking the amount of carbon dioxide that we exhale. Now, some of you guys may be familiar with this as well, but in the air around us, in the atmosphere, it is primarily, I think, about 70% or 75%. Perhaps you might need to correct me on that, but it is somewhere in the 70% range of nitrogen gas. And then the air we breathe is 21% oxygen, and then it is a very, very small amount of other gases like argon gas and even a very, very small amount of carbon dioxide. Now, when we breathe in the atmospheric air around us, it is 21% oxygen, and when we exhale a breath, it is usually, depending on how long you held it in your lungs, but usually 17% oxygen. So the oxygen saturation of that air that you inhaled and then exhaled went down by 4%. This is actually something that I learned in EMT school. As you talk about CPR, if you were to give somebody mouth to mouth, it's a cool thing to understand that there's still 17% of that air you're exhaling into their lungs by giving mouth to mouth during CPR, which should be an adequate amount to partially oxygenate them. Sometimes we get this, bad idea that all of the air you exhale is carbon dioxide. It's not, but that 4% of oxygen that we lost is made up for in carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide that we exhale comes from the sources of energy from our food, from whether that is a carbohydrate, whether that is a fat that we ingested, whether that is a body fat molecule that we have lipolyzed and used for energy in our bodies. The carbons, after we have extracted the energy from those molecules, the carbons will be exhaled. Now, as I've described that, I want to go into a little more detail about how we measure calories. How do we measure the amount of calories burned? You may have heard, it's very common to see on food labels that 2,000 calories per day is used for general nutrition advice in the United States. I actually think for many people that's a little low. I would say probably the average energy expenditure in the United States is about probably 2,500, so 2,500 calories. But anyways, I think we're all familiar with the fact that we eat and we burn calories. Now, how do we know how many calories we burn? Like if I were to give somebody a diet plan for them to lose weight, how do I know how many calories they burn? And the answer can be described in a couple ways, but the first one is exactly as I was talking about, the amount of carbon dioxide we exhale. And when we're measuring that, it is called indirect calorimetry. And so we can measure that in two ways, both of which are very cool. The first one is called spirometry. Now, you might have seen, like in an exercise lab, there are certain masks that will go over somebody's mouth and nose, and it will be, supplied with pressurized air for them to breathe in, atmospheric air, but then it will extract the amount of air that we exhale, specifically, and measure the carbon dioxide of that air that we exhale. And that is called spirometry. And by doing that, we can very literally measure exactly the amount of carbon dioxide that they're exhaling. And this is very useful to use when somebody's performing a bout of exercise. So somebody could run on the treadmill while wearing this. Somebody could ride on a bike or a rowing machine while they do this. Somebody could even, sit in some sort of a resistance training weight machine while they do this. And we measure the amount of carbon dioxide that is exhaled, and then we can use that to see how many glucose molecules, how many fat molecules must have been broken down to produce that. Now, another form of indirect calorimetry that measures this same thing is actually very, very interesting to me. It's called doubly labeled water. So, of course, the chemical formula for water is H2O, meaning there are 2 molecules of hydrogen and 1 molecule of oxygen. Now, if you look at a periodic table, it says the atomic mass or the molar mass of each element on the periodic table. And the molar mass of a hydrogen is 1 gram, and the molar mass of oxygen is 16 grams. Now, this specially doubly labeled water is a solution of water that contains 2 different isotopes of water. An isotope is simply, it's the same molecule. It has the same number of protons and electrons as the molecule, but a different number of neutrons, so it has a different molecular weight, a different molar mass. So it will contain half water that is H2O, where the hydrogens are, they each weigh 2 grams per mole rather than just 1. And then they also contain, the other half of the solution is water that has an isotope of oxygen that is 18 grams rather than 16 grams. So both of these waters are going to have a molar mass of 20 grams rather than 18 grams of the normal water. And then what we can do is actually measure the person's urine, because we have the special isotope of hydrogen and the special isotope of oxygen. Now, as we burn calories, that hydrogen that is specially labeled will only be released in the urine. Again, when we burn energy, it is released into carbon dioxide and water, and that specially labeled hydrogen atom will only be released in the urine because there's no hydrogen in carbon dioxide. But then that specially labeled oxygen will be released both in the carbon dioxide we exhale and in the water that we release through our urine. So what you can do is you can collect somebody's urine and you can look at the differences in the concentration of the radio-labeled water and the oxygen and use that to detect how much carbon dioxide was produced. Now, perhaps that was a little too much chemistry for some of you guys. If it was, I apologize. You might have been able to tell that I kind of stumbled over my words there myself. It is a very cool procedure, and it is incredibly accurate. It gives us a very, very good idea of how many calories somebody burns in a day. The issue with it, though, is that it is very expensive. It's very expensive to make the doubly labeled water, and it's very expensive to have access to the tools that we need to, test somebody's urine and find that difference in the specially labeled hydrogen and the specially labeled oxygen. It's very accurate, and it's very cool because you can give it to somebody and you don't need them to stay in your lab all day, and then you can still get very accurate counts of the amount of calories that person burned. The downside being that it is expensive. Now, there is also direct calorimetry, and direct calorimetry measures heat. And the calories we eat in food, of course, will translate to mechanical energy. The chemical potential energy of the food and the fat stores on our body they'll be broken down, and that energy will be released as kinetic mechanical energy in the form of motion, and then eventually all of that energy will be converted into heat, kinetic heat energy. And so there are special rooms, boxes that somebody can go inside of in, of course, some sort of a nutrition or exercise lab, and they're insulated and they're surrounded by this layer of water, and then the water will be measured for its increase in heat, and whatever heat increase occurred while that person was inside of that room, that will be considered our energy expenditure. Now, as I described that to you, you probably have already noticed the limitation is that, well, these rooms really can't be very big. It's probably pretty hard and pretty expensive to make these boxes. But then also, they're not going to have windows. They're not probably going to be very comfortable and enjoyable to stay in for long periods of time. So if we want to see how many calories somebody burns in one day, but then we keep them in this little tiny box, we're probably not going to get a very good idea, because they're not going to have a normal day. They're not going to be walking around and talking to their friends or their spouse. They're not, it's probably not a very good way to measure like a daily energy expenditure. Same with the spirometry that I talked about. No one's going to keep that mask on their face all day. You have to eat, you have to drink water. So there's limitations to that. And so in that regard, a doubly labeled water is going to be the best way to accomplish that. However, direct calorimetry can be useful if we want to measure, again, like spirometry, the amount of calories that we burn during a bout of exercise, on a treadmill, on a bike, etc. Or I have heard of examples of people sleeping in a direct calorimetry room. And again, that might not be super comfortable, but it is supplied with oxygen for the people to breathe. It's not going to hurt them or harm them in any way. And it might be, more appealing for somebody to go inside of this room and then immediately just lay down in bed and go to sleep. That might be another implication of this direct calorimetry. Now, on top of that, the next thing I want to discuss is as we are burning calories, as we're releasing carbon dioxide, there's something that we can measure called our respiratory quotient. And it's something that I think is very, very cool. Basically, what we do is we measure the amount of oxygen that we inhale versus the amount of carbon dioxide that we exhale. Now, going back to that equation for photosynthesis, or in the reverse, cellular respiration, 6 carbon dioxides and 6 water molecules will be converted into 1 molecule of glucose and 6 oxygens. And so if you think about that for a moment, that means that if we were to burn exclusively glucose for fuel, which is how the body burns carbohydrates, all carbohydrates will be eventually converted into some form of glucose for cellular respiration and energy production. If we are using only carbohydrates for fuel, then for every 6 oxygens we inhale, we will exhale 6 carbon dioxides. So that is a 1-to-1 ratio. So our respiratory quotient will be 1. And if that's the case, if you measure that, again, through a mask, we will be able to understand that you are burning only carbohydrates for your fuel at that time. And that is usually done during very, very extreme levels of exercise, that your body is only burning carbohydrates. On the other end, if we were to only burn fats, we would have a respiratory quotient of 0.7. That means that for every 7 molecules of oxygen that we inhale, we would exhale 10 molecules of carbon dioxide. So if we had a respiratory quotient of 0.7, we would know that we were only burning fats. Now, of course, usually it's never on one end or the other. Usually it's going to be somewhere in the middle, and that just means that we are using a combination of each for our energy. Now, if we were to be only burning fats for fuel, usually that's accomplished during low intensity exercise, whether that is simply sitting around and burning calories, sitting or sleeping, or whether that is just going on a simple walk. That is why you'll actually hear many people recommend to just go on a walk for fat burning. Now, that is obviously, the idea is correct. When you're doing that low intensity exercise, you are burning primarily fat for fuel. However, it all just comes down to the amount of carbons coming in and the amount of carbons going out. So even if you do burn more or even exclusively carbohydrates during your exercise, eventually you're going to get to a point, you're not exercising all day. You will get to a point where if the calories you are eating are less than the calories you are burning, the energy needs to come from somewhere, and then it will be made up for in fat. Now, that's not anything against walking. I love walking. I think it is a great, great tool for everybody. Those who are seeking to lose body fat, I do suggest you employ walking. I do it myself. It doesn't really make you fatigued. It doesn't make you very hungry. Usually it can be very enjoyable. You can have a good conversation with a friend or with your partner, and it can be a very great tool for fat loss. Now, the next thing I wanted to go into, now that we've talked about how we know how many calories we're burning, where that fuel might come from, I wanted to discuss what processes occur in our body that cause us to burn calories. Why do we need to burn calories? And that calorie expenditure is usually classified into 4 main groups. Now, as a whole, this is called your total daily energy expenditure. You'll see that written as TDEE. But it is composed of 4 groups. The first one being your basal metabolic rate, or your BMR. Now, your BMR is defined as the amount of calories you would burn in a day awake and fasted if you just sat around, laid around all day long. The reason you have to be fasted is because there's another category that has to do with digestion and food. But so we burn calories all the time. All the time, even when we're sleeping. It takes energy to do all sorts of things in our body. So for example, as our cells are replicating their DNA and dividing, that is going to take energy. As our body produces certain hormones and enzymes for various processes in our body, as our fingernails grow and our hair grows, and we, secrete saliva and mucus on, some of our membranes, and probably this is sounding gross now, and I apologize, but everything in our body takes calories and takes energy to do. And in fact, for the vast majority of people, the basal metabolic rate is going to be the majority of the calories that you burn in a day. In fact, it's common for the basal metabolic rate to account for about 60 to 70% of your total daily energy expenditure, your TDEE. Now, the next category of calories burned is your thermic effect of food, written as your TEF. This is the one that relates to our digestion. And the idea is just that when we digest food, it takes some energy to get that energy out of the food. And this thermic effect of food can relate to the mechanical churning and transportation of the food throughout our digestive system. It can be categorized by the production of certain digestive enzymes and compounds, chemicals, hormones even, in response to our eating and our satiety. All of these things, again, take energy. Now, the thermic effect of food is going to vary depending on what your diet is. The thermic effect of eating protein is actually about 20 to 30% of the calories that you get from eating that protein. For carbohydrates, it's about 5 to 10%. So again, if you ate 100 calories of carbohydrates because of that thermic effect of the food, you would really probably only get 95 or 90 calories out of that 100 calories of carbohydrates. And then the thermic effect of eating fats is 0 to 3%. So very, very low. It could even be none at all. Depending on the type of fat, if your body's ready to use it very rapidly, it does not burn very many calories to digest fat. Now, of course, like I said, the exact percentage of the thermic effect of food on your daily energy expenditure is going to depend on what you're eating. For most people, it comes out to about 5 to 10% of your energy expenditure. Now, your BMR and your TEF together are sometimes referred to as your resting metabolic rate. That's just a one-word change from your basal metabolic rate. But that's because, again, your BMR is defined by your awake and your fasting, whereas with the thermic effect of food, you're no longer fasting. So it could just be your resting metabolic rate. But that's not a term that I see used very frequently. It's not a term that I will use very frequently. Now, after your resting metabolic rate, the remainder, of course, is the calories you burn in activity. Now, there's even two different types of activity. The first one is called non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and the second one is, of course, exercise activity thermogenesis. Now, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis is often abbreviated as your NEAT, N-E-A-T, of course. And then your exercise activity is not commonly abbreviated. If you did, it would be the word EAT, which perhaps is fitting in a nutrition sense, but it's usually just called your exercise activity. Now, those are the four main groups. And your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, believe it or not, actually usually accounts for more calories burned than your exercise activity. Now, your non-exercise activity is exactly what that sounds like. It's any activity you do all day long, anything outside of sitting on the couch all day that is not exercise. Now, there's not a literal scientific definition to distinguish between your NEAT and your exercise activity. It's more of a psychological thing where it's just if you are doing something with the intention to train, to burn calories, to exercise, then it's exercise activity. Otherwise, when you are standing, you're using your muscles in a very small way to keep your body upright and supported, and that is going to take calories. Me sitting here as I speak to you on this podcast is using energy to talk to you, to move my mouth and to produce noise. That is non-exercise activity. Some people have a habit of tapping their foot all day long. Some people you may know are very dynamic speakers and they love to speak with their hands. All of that is non-exercise activity. And it actually seems that if you're trying to manipulate your energy expenditure, probably the most meaningful one is your non-exercise activity. Now, technically speaking, you cannot intentionally manipulate your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, because if you did, then it would just be considered exercise activity because it's done with the intention of increasing calories. However, when you look at one person versus another person, sometimes you'll hear people say things like, oh, well, my metabolism's so slow as I get older and things like that. Usually that's not the case. In fact, the data to support the idea of your metabolism slowing down as you age is actually pretty poor. Usually what it is just that your non-exercise activity, and in many cases your exercise activity as well, has dramatically decreased. You sit at a desk all day rather than walking around. Sometimes as people do get older, they feel more fatigued. Perhaps they have joint pain, which discourages them from engaging in non-exercise activity, things like that. They're not as standing up and walking around, moving with their hands and arms and things like that. And all of that can affect your NEAT. And then your EAT, or your exercise activity, is actually going to account for a relatively small amount of your daily energy expenditure, usually about 10%. Of course, that can vary greatly, but even in someone who's a very, very, very high-level athlete, say someone burns like 4,000 calories in a day because they're a cross-country runner and they run a lot all day long, even in that sort of a person, their calories from exercise activity is usually only going to be up to 40%. Of course, there's exceptions to these. There's some freak athletes. We've heard about how Michael Phelps used to eat 12,000 calories a day, and none of that was very scientific. I don't know if we have an exact number for how much he was actually burning, but in a case like that, it could go beyond 50%. But I hope you understand that it's probably unproductive to try and dramatically lose body fat by dramatically increasing your exercise. It's going to take too much out of you, take too much time probably. Now, the one way that we really can affect the amount of calories that we burn in a day is by the amount of muscle that we have. So that is a reason that I will always recommend to people that when you're trying to lose weight, even if you don't want to be a bodybuilder or a powerlifter or what have you, it's a good idea to increase your muscle. And again, we'll go into increasing muscle later in this episode, but increasing your muscle is a very, very important thing for reducing the risk of chronic disease, helping yourself be mobile and active into your old age, as well as it will increase both your basal metabolic rate, because you're going to have more cells that are dividing, replicating, and creating certain enzymes and things like that, as well as you do perform your NEAT, there's more fibers, muscle tissue that is performing that work of keeping yourself upright and things like that, which means that it will increase your calories burned. Moving on, now that we've kind of talked about all the different ways that our body uses energy and how we can measure that, how do we know how much energy is in food? Now, the three macronutrients are proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. Proteins and carbohydrates have 4 calories for every gram, and fats have 9 calories per gram. Alcohol also is technically a calorie supplying nutrient, although nutrient kind of gives it the wrong idea, because alcohol is bad for you, and I do not recommend people drink it if you are trying to be serious about your health. But 1 gram of alcohol, of course, many alcoholic beverages are mostly water. However, 1 gram of alcohol contains 7 calories per gram. The way that we have determined these values is by something called bomb calorimetry. Now, this is a practice that is scrutinized in a lot of ways. Some people, especially those people who I've mentioned before, don't believe in calories. They will kind of poke holes in this and find the flaws in bomb calorimetry. I'm not saying that bomb calorimetry is perfect, and I'll go into some of the flaws about it as well, but it is accurate. It really is accurate for the amount of energy stored in some foods. So basically, a bomb calorimeter is a little chamber. It's kind of like the direct calorimetry box that I've told you. It is surrounded by water, it's insulated, and then we measure the change in heat of that water as we light the food on fire. That's what you do. So if it was perhaps a wet food or something that doesn't burn, what you can do is put it in a freeze dryer to remove all of the water, and then you light it on fire. A food perhaps like bread or a potato chip might not need to be dehydrated at all because it is relatively dry and could be lit on fire exactly as is. And then as we light that food on fire in the bomb calorimeter, all of the energy within those bonds of the food will be released. We'll heat up the water, and we are able to understand how much energy measured by calories is in that food. It's a very, very cool process. Now, some of the limitations to it, however, are, for example, say we freeze-dried rather, perhaps like a piece of meat or something that was high in protein. Some of those foods might not burn very well and very accurately, as well as we might be breaking chemical bonds that are not broken in a human digestive system, which might help kind of overestimate the amount of calories in a food. On that same wavelength of breaking bonds that are not digested in human digestion, a big drawback to that is that of fiber. Fiber, as well as a substance called lignin. Lignin is a plant structure. It is really what makes it's wood. When you hear lignin, you should think of wood. Now, if I, as a human, were to eat blocks of wood or sawdust all day long, my digestive system cannot extract the calories that are within the bonds of the lignin, and so it would provide no calories to me. However, of course, you could put wood inside of a bomb calorimeter and light it on fire, and you would get a reading of lots of calories. Now, for that same reason, charcoal has calories and uranium has calories. I've even seen funny videos, on Instagram or whatever, about people advertising certain bulking foods, and chicken has this many calories, ground beef have this many calories, peanut butter has this many calories, olive oil has this many calories. Of course, during a bulk, most people want high calorie foods, and then they go into uranium has 1 billion calories per gram, which is, again, technically true, because all a calorie is a measure of energy, but that doesn't mean that we can get that energy out of it from eating wood or charcoal definitely not uranium. Lignin, by the way, can actually be found in some vegetables. Perhaps if you've ever purchased asparagus from the store, fresh asparagus, it's common to break off that bottom portion that's gotten very, very hard before you cook it. And the reason it's gotten very hard like that is because some of the starches have converted into lignin. Now, fiber is the same way. It's very, very, very good for us to eat fiber. And a lot of those benefits come from the fact that fiber is not digested, or at least not fully digested, depending on the type of fiber. It can help the gut microbiome in our large intestine. It helps those bacteria have a food source to ferment and grow and become healthier. It can also draw water into the stool and reduce risk of things like constipation and colon cancer. It can be very, very good for us, but of course, same as wood or lignin, if you put that into a bomb calorimeter, although our body does not extract calories from it, you would see a calorie reading in the bomb calorimeter. So again, with all that said, it's definitely not a perfect system, but it is a very cool tool, very cool to know about. Now, as a practical application, it is probably not very realistic for you to go to a lab and do exercise wearing a spirometer or inside of a direct calorimeter room, or again, very expensive to drink doubly labeled water. How can you find out how many calories per day you burn? Now, what I'm going to recommend to you, I think what most people recommend, is to use a TDEE calculator. One more time, TDEE is your total daily energy expenditure. And a TDEE calculator is going to ask you for various things like your age, your height, and your weight. It's even more accurate if you know your body fat percentage, though I know a lot of people don't, because it will, we burn different amounts of calories depending on what portion of our weight is lean tissue versus fat tissue. But it will ask you for certain things like that, and then it will use something called the Mifflin-St. Jeor equation. And Mifflin and St. Jeor were two scientists, of course, who just created this equation. And they created this equation based off of the data that I've been describing to you. So they have collected a database from hundreds of labs and studies about all different levels of energy expenditure during exercise, during rest, for all sorts of people of different ages and heights and weights. And using those numbers in those databases, they've come up with an equation that is, in most people, about 10% margin of error. So pretty close, realistically, to what your energy expenditure is. Now, some people, especially myself as a coach or even just someone giving nutritional advice, I'll always recommend that somebody uses a TDEE calculator. And sometimes I get weird looks, or people think, well, I thought you were like a scientist. There's no way this is very accurate. It's just some online thing. And I understand those concerns completely. But again, it's based on real science and has been proven by that real science to be within a 10% margin of error. So again, like I said, this equation is going to use an energy multiplier based on your activity level. The most common one is called tdeecalculator.net. It's the one that I use. And the thing that I like about it is that you put in whatever you think your activity level is. It has like sedentary, lightly active, moderately active, heavily active. And so you can put in whatever, but then when it gives you your results, it doesn't just give you one number. It actually gives you what your activity or what your calories burned would be for each and every activity level possible. Now, if you do that, and if you look at that, you might be surprised to know, or maybe if you trusted me, as I told you about our different ways to burn calories, the energy expenditure does not change much based on your activity level. It changes in meaningful ways, don't get me wrong, but usually it's about 1 to 2 to 300 calories per activity level, depending on your size. So perhaps say that you were lightly active, and then you increased to heavily active, which is a big jump, usually depending on, of course, on your height and your weight, because these are multiplier values. But it's usually only going to be 3, 4, 5, maybe 600 calories, depending on your activity level. And so that's, of course, a relatively small fraction of your daily energy expenditure, which is just why I think it's a more useful tool for burning fat to restrict your diet, restrict your calories consumed. When we are trying to burn fat tissue, there are 3,500 calories of stored energy in 1 pound of adipose tissue. That's actually really cool, I think, because it's divisible by 7, which is 7 days in a week. So if we divide 3,500 by 7, we get 500 calories, which means you would need to eat in a 500 calorie deficit each day for, in the span of 1 week, to burn 1 pound of body fat off of your body, which is actually a decent rate. And for most people, it's the rate of fat loss that I recommend. You can lose up to 2 pounds per week of body fat, but it is going to be a lot more fatiguing and perhaps challenging for many people. So 500 calorie deficit each day is pretty recommendable for me. The exact amount of weight you can lose, of course, varies in very big ways depending on the person. Specifically, the more obese you are, perhaps I shouldn't use that word, it's a buzzword, the more body fat tissue that you have available to lose, the higher your body fat percentage is, the more weight you can lose, the more fat you can lose in a week or in any given amount of time, while not really experiencing negative side effects from that. So another guideline that is given in some cases is about 1% of your body weight. So that would mean if you are 150 pounds, pretty fast weight loss for you would be 1.5 pounds per week, because that is 1% of your body weight. Whereas if somebody weighs 400 pounds, realistically, they could lose about 3 or 4 pounds per week, 1% of their body weight, for a decent, maintainable weight loss. Again, usually you'll see for most of the population about 1 to 2 pounds. Of course, that is a 500 to 1,000 calorie deficit each day. So I really don't recommend, unless it is 1% of your body weight, to go above that 2 pounds per week. I really don't. Just because you're going to run into territory of losing muscle and lean tissue, which is not favorable for your body composition. And really, it's just going to be hard. Really, it's kind of a crash diet. And I think a lot of people are not going to be able to stick to that for a very long time and end up seeing pretty poor results. Even at that 2 pound mark, depending on how much you eat in a day, for example, as we've talked about, some people burn about 2,000 calories. Usually that's going to be smaller individuals. Women, unfortunately, burn slightly less calories than men. But say you're a woman who burns 2,000 calories a day and you want to lose 2 pounds a week. That is half of your calories gone so that you can lose 2 pounds in a week. Now, again, if that 2 pounds a week is your 1% body weight, that's fine. But if it is your 1% body weight, it's probably not going to be half of your energy expenditure in a day. I admittedly will, sometimes when I'm trying to do an aggressive cut, get ready for perhaps summer or bodybuilding competition, I will try to lose 2 pounds a week. But as I am exercising in the gym, being active, getting my steps in, I burn about 3,000 calories in a day, which means if I have a deficit of 1,000 calories, then I still get to eat 2/3 of my energy expenditure, which is a lot more sustainable. But even for me, it can be very challenging. Moving on from that, I hope you guys have a really good idea at this point of calories, heat, food, energy, all those different things. I really enjoy providing an in-depth look at the science and the chemistry of all of this. And admittedly, that's because I'm a pretty big nerd. I know that some of you guys might not be as excited about that, but I think it's really valuable to understand what is going on. I really like when people ask why and how, and I hope to provide that for you. Moving on into the rest of our fat loss discussion, I want to address some of the myths. As well as in my first episode of this podcast, I discussed how we know what we do about nutrition and exercise, different types of studies and evidence and how strong that evidence is. And I realized after recording it that one thing I neglected to talk about that I wanted to was something called anecdata. Not as a mesh of the words anecdote and data. An anecdote is just a personal story that someone will share. And anecdata is, kind of a term that was coined for people who will share their personal experience and use their personal experience in whatever realm as sort of fact and hard scientific evidence. And usually, they have good reason to feel that way because they have had an experience in a certain way. But the flaw of this is that most people who are sharing anecdata with you might not have a very good understanding of the limitations and the controls and the other factors that might have gone into it. So I don't want to say it's bad evidence. I certainly don't want to say it's not evidence. Everything is evidence. It's just not very strong and compelling evidence. So if ever somebody is sharing anecdata with you and stating that this must be truth and scientific fact, I would encourage you to be very skeptical of that. There are a lot of myths surrounding weight loss, and unfortunately, I think a big reason for why there are so many myths and misinformation in this realm is because simply a lot of people are not interested in doing the hard work required to get these favorable outcomes. And they are always looking for a magic pill or a well-kept secret that someone is willing to share with them that will just make all their problems go away. But really all that is profitable for the person sharing those things with you. There really is no magic secret. It's consistency, controlling your diet, and increasing your activity level. Anyways, going into some of those myths, I see things like a lot of people will say, well, calories in, calories out doesn't work. It doesn't matter. It's not how weight loss is dictated. It's dictated by your hormones and by your insulin levels in your blood. Some people will say your weight loss is caused by these processed foods and it's caused by these food additives and artificial colors and preservatives. The reason that America is getting so fat is because these chemicals are harmful and cause our body to gain body fat. And both of those arguments are true in some ways. They are. And you might be surprised to hear me say that, but they're not true. They're not true in the sense that calories in and calories out don't matter. They're not true in the sense that those are actually the things that at the end of the day dictate your weight loss, but they have some aspects of truth involved in them. For example, a very common thing is for women with PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome, to say that they are unable to lose weight because their PCOS affects their hormones. As well as people will say, oh, well, as a man, if you don't, eat raw liver, then your testosterone is going to be low. And if your testosterone is low, then you're never going to lose body fat because it's the fat loss hormone. And those things are true. If you, for example, I don't want to be sensitive to somebody who tells you should be eating raw liver, but I will be definitely sensitive to somebody with PCOS. If there's anybody who hears this that has PCOS, your hormones do affect your weight loss. They do. But they affect your weight loss in a way that if your hormones are messed up and not optimal, you might just feel tired and groggy. You might not feel energized and motivated to go to the gym and be active. You might feel sick and tired and feel more comfortable staying at home, laying down. Those things do affect your weight loss, but they affect your weight loss because they affect the amount of calories out that you burn. Same with testosterone. Low testosterone would do the exact same thing, as well as your insulin or hunger hormones, or if those things get out of whack, they can increase your hunger, often causing you to eat more food, which does affect your weight loss, but it affects your weight loss because it affects the amount of calories in. So these things are true, but they are true by means of calories in and calories out. Same with the ingredients that I wanted to talk about. These ultra-processed foods and the things like that, the colors and the additives and the preservatives, they of themselves are not causing obesity, but these ultra-processed foods and these additives that you put in them that make them more stable, have a longer shelf life, have a better texture, They make these foods cheaper and therefore more readily available for people to consume, and they make these foods hyper palatable. So when you start eating them, you don't want to stop eating them. So it leads to an overconsumption of calories. The same can be talked about for the flip side, healthy foods. People say the reason you're not losing fat is because you're not eating healthy foods. And I mean, you should be eating healthy foods if you're trying to lose weight because it makes it easier. So for example, if you're eating a diet that is high in fiber and a diet that is high in protein, you're going to feel full longer. Those foods increase your satiety. That is your feeling of fullness. If you eat high volume foods like fruits and vegetables, then the amount of food in your stomach, in your digestive system, will stretch it out and send signals to your body that you are full and you can stop eating. Therefore, weight loss is easier. However, it is possible to eat foods like Twinkies and ultra-processed foods, and it is possible to have bad hormones and still lose weight if your calories in are less than your calories out. There was actually, you may have heard about a professor a little while ago now, I believe, out of Kansas State University. He was a professor of nutrition, and they call him the Twinkie Man because he underwent a diet where he ate just 1,800 calories a day of things like Twinkies. I believe he took a vitamin and mineral supplement as well as had some protein shakes to make sure that he stayed healthy throughout this. But then the remainder of his calories came from unhealthy, ultra-processed foods like Twinkies. And he lost weight. His blood cholesterol levels improved. And, people sometimes will hear that and be like, oh, that's awesome. I'm going to do that. And again, I take a step back and I say, while it's possible, it's not likely that that's going to happen if you're not strict to that diet because, 1,800 calories of Twinkies is not very many Twinkies. You're going to feel very, very hungry all the time, and that will lead you to eat more food. It is a very valuable tool to eat those healthy foods like fruits and vegetables and fiber and whole grains and protein. Moving on, there are some people nowadays, it's the carnivore diet. Many people will just push their one type of diet. A long time ago, that was the vegan diet. Like I said, nowadays, more so it's the carnivore diet. I think the ketogenic diet has always kind of been around. And again, a lot of these people will kind of use anecdata to support their claims, tell personal stories about the changes that they saw. And again, I don't want to invalidate or say that these stories weren't true, but in any of these diets, the reason you lost weight is because your calories in were less than your calories out. They are all restrictive in a variety of ways, and usually that restriction leads to a calorie deficit. Now, the thing that I think is funny is that back when the vegan and vegetarian diets were more popular, you would see people share their anecdotes about the diet, and they would say, well, when I switched to being a vegan, my hair and my skin got healthier, I had more energy, I had less brain fog, things like that. Very, very desirable side effects of this diet. But the funny thing now is that now that people are adopting the carnivore diet, which is a diet of nothing but meat and eggs, and in some cases, some people include dairy, that is the polar opposite of the vegan and vegetarian diet. And they'll say the same things. They'll say, oh, I started the carnivore diet. Now my hair and my skin look amazing and are so healthy, and I have more energy and I have less brain fog. It's the exact same benefits of the vegan diet that people are purporting while they're polar opposite diets. So perhaps those are benefits of being in a calorie deficit and improving your body composition. Now, the ketogenic diet, that is just a diet where you remove all carbohydrates from your diet with the exception of some fiber. But all starches and sugars, you cut them out of your diet. I think most of you will be familiar with the ketogenic diet. That is one that has been popular for a very long time, is still very popular. And while it can be effective, I do not recommend the ketogenic diet to anyone outside of someone with a certain metabolic sickness, like type 2 diabetes. If you're just trying to lose weight and you have no adverse health scenarios, you're not in that position, I don't really recommend it. But I want to dive into why it's so popular. So our bodies, let me start over. Our preferred source of energy are carbohydrates. And I might receive some flack for saying that, but it's true. That's because carbohydrates are the most efficient source of energy. So remember back when we were talking about the respiratory quotient. At that point where we're burning strictly carbs, it's usually happening during high intensity exercise. And the reason for that is because our body is very efficient at converting those carbohydrates into fuel. So it's optimal for things like high intensity exercise. Now, because of that, we store our carbohydrates in the form of glycogen all throughout our body. We store them in our muscle cells, and we store a good amount in our liver as well, so that the liver can shuttle them out to whatever tissues need them. And that glycogen stored in the muscle or the liver is accompanied by water. Carbs are water soluble. And there's, certain debates over how much water, but I think a general consensus is that 1 gram of glycogen stores is going to be accompanied by 2 to 3, sometimes people will say 4 grams of water. Now, say that you go on a ketogenic diet. Throughout perhaps that first week of the diet or perhaps the first few days, your body will start burning up those glycogen stores in your muscle and in your liver, and you won't be eating any carbs to replace that glycogen, which means that the stores get depleted. And when the glycogen is depleted, that water that was with the glycogen will also get depleted. You'll simply pee or sweat it out. But then, all because you have lowered your carb intake, you will rapidly lose a lot of body weight. Notice how I said body weight. You'll step on the scale and you were 250 pounds at the start of the week, and now at the end of the week, you're 240 pounds. Sometimes even better, maybe you're 235 pounds. And you think, oh my goodness, this ketogenic diet is incredible. And again, you've restricted food, meaning you've likely restricted your calories in. And so it can be a viable means for weight loss. However, at the next point where you eat carbohydrates, especially many people on the ketogenic diet will become very diet fatigued and they will binge after. They move away from their diet and they binge and they eat a lot of carbohydrates. When you eat those carbohydrates, your muscles and your liver will replace their glycogen stores very quickly and very rapidly along with that water. And then all of a sudden in one day, you've gained back a significant portion of the weight that you thought you lost. And the unfortunate thing about this is it can actually, for a lot of people, reinforce the idea of how wonderful the keto diet is because once they finally ate carbs again, they got fat again and they gained all that weight back. And so they believe that the ketogenic diet is the only one that works, whereas that's not actually the case. Now, on that topic, I heard it explained very, very well by Lane Norton. Dr. Lane Norton is someone I look up to. He gives very, very good information about nutrition. And he explained it in a way of you have to restrict something, right? To achieve calories in, calories out, obviously we hope to be active. Like I said, I encourage resistance training for optimal outcomes. But then for the calories in, you have to restrict something. And the different types of things that you can restrict work better for different people. They do, and that's great. I think you should pick the tool that really works for you that you can stick to. Consistency really is the most important thing. Now, some examples of that restriction is, first of all, calories. This is something that I prefer to do. Many people just restrict the calories. They count the calories they eat each day, and then obviously, hopefully they're eating reasonably healthy foods, but then they can still include some, less healthy foods like candy. I love Mike and Ike's, and sometimes I'll try and fit Mike and Ike's into my diet because they're my favorite candy. As long as you are counting calories and restricting them below your maintenance calories, your calories out, then you will lose weight. Now, another one that is popular is the time, and this is intermittent fasting. Basically, intermittent fasting is there is a certain window of the day where you are allowed to eat. Usually it's 6 hours or 8 hours. Sometimes it can be even more strict, like 4 hours per day. So for example, let's say 6. You're only allowed to eat food each day from the time of 12 o'clock noon to 6 p.m. And outside of that time frame, you're not allowed to eat at all. And some people do really well with this because it's a very hard and fast rule that outside of this window, you're not allowed to eat. And so they eat during this window, and then outside of that window, it's easier to say, I'm not going to eat any food at all, than sometimes it is to say, oh, I'm going to control my portions and my calories. And then just because they've restricted the amount of time each day they're allowed to eat, they end up eating less food, less calories, right? Next, a common one to do is portion size. And this is one that I actually recommend to most people. I think it's probably the best tool because it allows you to eat your exact same diet, but your portion size. Say for breakfast, you eat bacon and eggs and toast, and then for lunch, you have a sandwich. For dinner, you have spaghetti and meatballs, and then before bed, you have ice cream. And let's say that all of that comes out to 3,000 calories each day. If you were to simply take that meal schedule that I've just described and then cut your portions down so that you're eating 2/3 the amount of food, of course, you might have to get used to it. You might feel a little hungry, but you're eating all the exact same foods that you enjoy eating. And now because you're only eating 2/3 the amount of food, you're eating 2,000 calories a day rather than 3,000, which can be very, very valuable to some people. Another type of restriction is carbs, just like I was talking about with the ketogenic diet. Now, if you pursue the ketogenic diet and you are replacing the carbs that you used to eat with certain ketogenic foods, which are often very high in fat, it is probably not going to be so beneficial. Now, there are some people who will talk about the ketogenic diet and they will talk about, oh, when you enter ketosis, your body just becomes so much more efficient at burning fat. And while that is true in certain instances, it doesn't mean that you burn extra calories just from being in ketosis. In fact, I came across an Instagram profile a while ago now, but it was this guy who shares ketogenic recipes with you. Recipes that are yummy, that you could eat, that are still considered keto, so they're good treats and good snacks for you, which is a great idea, a valuable thing for many people on the ketogenic diet. But I want to say that the one video that came across my feed that I saw was like a cream cheese and pickle wrapped in like melted cheese that you had made crispy, which I just feel like if you were outside of this realm and you didn't understand the ketogenic diet, that doesn't seem like a diet food at all, right? You're wrapping cheese around cream cheese and a pickle. It just seems kind of silly. If you're replacing all of your carbs with things like that, or some people, when they go on the ketogenic diet, they start putting butter in their coffee and they start eating a ton of bacon, things that they didn't even used to eat, and they're replacing their carbs with these fats. Of course, fats have more than double the calories of carbs. Sometimes it is not even going to result in weight loss at all for those reasons. However, my dad, for a little while, consumed the ketogenic diet in the sake of his health, and he did it in the way that I would recommend everyone do it who's trying to do the ketogenic diet for weight loss. And pretty much what that was is he took his same diet and just removed all of the carb sources. So for example, I don't know exactly what he did eat, but again, for example, say you eat bacon and eggs and toast for breakfast in the morning, say you eat a sandwich for lunch, say you eat spaghetti and meatballs for dinner, then by just removing all of the carb sources out of that, you would just have the bacon and eggs for breakfast and no toast. And you would have your sandwich for lunch, perhaps wrapped in lettuce rather than on bread. And then at dinner time, rather than having spaghetti noodles, you could have like a spaghetti squash. And maybe if you're used to having, ice cream or something, at dinner time, maybe you switch to, a lower carb version, something like a sorbet. And so you have the same diet, but you've just removed all the carb sources. And removing those carb sources removes calories. You've lowered your calories in. Now, the last type of restriction that I'll go into is just a type of food. This is something that I'll see very common. Some people want to get in better shape, and so they say, I ate no sugar for 60 days. I ate no dessert foods or no processed foods for 60 days. And I think that's an admirable thing to do. You can get a lot of benefit out of eating whole, nutritious foods. I will very seldom say that a food is unhealthy, because when you say something is unhealthy, to me it sounds like it's actively harming you. And in most cases, that is not ever the case. Most foods are not going to actively harm you, but rather some foods that are considered unhealthy by some people are just devoid of the micronutrients and the phytochemicals and the antioxidants and the fiber and protein that other healthier foods do have. Now, anyways, sometimes, if you had a diet where you were consuming those frequently, daily, weekly, and then all of a sudden you cut them out and your diet is the same, what have you done? You've restricted your calories in. So again, it's not about, these things are causing you to be fat. It's just that you've restricted your calories in versus your calories out. Now, to kind of nail this point home, I found a study that I really liked out of the New England Journal of Medicine. The title of this study is Comparison of Weight Loss Diets with Different Compositions of Fat, Protein, and Carbohydrates. So basically they just designed different types of studies they designed different types of diets that had different macronutrient profiles. One would be more ketogenic, one would be more carb heavy. They had different levels of protein, and they wanted to see if weight loss matters based on your macronutrient ratios, or if it just mattered based on calories. Now, in this study, they followed 800 participants, which is pretty good for a trial like this, for 2 years. Now, I wanted to read some quotes from this study because it's really, really good. Real quickly as well, this is a study from 2009, and it was conducted in conjunction with Harvard Medical School and Louisiana State University. Now, one of the things I liked in their introduction, they said they were talking about how studies similar to this had been done in the past, but they say small samples, underrepresentation of men, limited generalizability, a lack of blind ascertainment of the outcome, a lack of data on adherence to assigned diets, a large loss to follow-up limit the interpretation of many weight loss trials. The crucial question is whether overweight people have a better response in the long term to diets that emphasize a specific macronutrient. Thus, we recognize the need for a large trial that would be designed to overcome the limitations of previous trials. Now, again, they followed 800 participants for 2 years, and they assigned them to 4 different diet groups. The nutrient goals for the 4 diet groups were 20% fat, 15% protein, and 65% carbohydrates. So this is a low-fat, average protein diet. The second group was 20% fat, 25% protein, and 55% carbohydrates. This was considered a low-fat, high-protein diet. The third group was 40% fat, 15% protein, and 45% carbohydrates. This was considered high-fat, average protein. And then 40% fat, 25% protein, and 35% carbohydrates. This was considered high-fat and high protein. Now, as they followed these participants for the duration of 2 years, they found that most of the weight loss occurred in the first 6 months, and then many people regained some of the weight from 6 months to 2 years. They did employ various strategies to help with diet adherence. They had support groups and like classes that you could attend weekly to kind of teach you about tools and tactics for maintaining your diet, motivate you to stick to your diet, and so on. And one thing that I actually think was really, really cool about this study design is they used biometric tools to understand whether or not somebody adhered to their diet properly. Now, again, this was a 2-year study. So over a 2-year study, it's not like you can keep somebody in your lab and monitor exactly what they eat all the time for 2 years. That'd be completely unrealistic and very expensive. But what they tried to do, again, with these classes, is just teach the people about what their diet was supposed to look like, encourage them to keep it, and teach them tools of how to. But then what they did is they measured the amount of nitrogen in somebody's urine, and they measured the respiratory quotient to determine whether or not they adhered to their diet properly. So again, if somebody was in a higher carbohydrate, a higher fat versus a lower fat group, going back to that respiratory quotient, depending on what that quotient was, they could tell if the majority of somebody's energy expenditure was coming from calories provided by fat or coming from carbohydrates. And then the amount of nitrogen in somebody's urine could measure the amount of protein they were consuming. So if someone was in a high or a low protein group, we would expect to see more nitrogen in the urine for somebody who is eating more protein. And, well, basically, they were able to confirm using these biometric numbers that the people on average were very compliant with the diet group that they were assigned to. Now, when we look at the amount of weight loss compared between those who had high fat, low fat, high carbohydrate, low carbohydrate, we see that the differences were mostly similar. In fact, I want to say when it comes to the fats and the carbohydrates, most all of the groups were within the averages of the weight loss between the high and low were within the margin of error for the statistics, meaning that you can't really find a significant difference. Now, if you remember from episode 1, we talked about the p-value, and the p-value talks about the strength of a difference. Basically, it tells you if this difference occurred by random chance, what is the probability that we would be able to replicate the results that we got in this study. So you want a low p-value to describe strong statistical outcomes. The gold standard for p-value is 0.05. Anything higher than that number means that there was not a significant difference between these groups. Now, what we see is, for example, the difference in weight loss between the high-fat and the low-fat group had a p-value of 0.94. So that is a very, very bad p-value. The difference in weight loss between those with high carbohydrate and low carbohydrate was 0.42. So that's, of course, better than 0.9, but it is still far above our gold standard of 0.05, meaning that there was not a significant difference between the groups. Now, in fact, there was never a significant difference between any of the groups, but what you will find is that the lowest p-values occur in the differences in protein, which doesn't surprise me at all. Doesn't surprise me at all because, again, protein helps with your satiety. It helps you feel more full. Protein is going to increase your lean muscle mass, which likely will help you be more active and burn more calories like we talked about, and therefore lose more weight. Now, in the discussion, if you're not familiar, at every scientific article that is published, usually they'll take the results and the author will offer a discussion, some insights, and some thoughts about what conclusions can be drawn from the results that were got, some of the reasons for what we saw in the article. In the discussion of this article, I wanted to read 2 different lines for you. The first one says, "The principal finding of this study is that the diets were equally successful in promoting clinical meaningful weight loss and the maintenance of weight loss over the course of 2 years." So that might be something that I failed to mention. I did mention that the weight loss was similar. However, the rebound after the initial weight loss, so for that 6-month portion to 2-year portion, where many people regained some of the weight, that was also statistically the same between all the different groups. So there was no difference in the amount of weight lost and no difference in the amount of weight regained. Now, the next line says, these divergent results suggest that any type of diet, when taught for the purpose of weight loss with enthusiasm and persistence, can be effective. When non-nutritional influences are minimized, as they were in our study, the specific macronutrient content is of minor importance. And that is what I want you guys to understand, is that there are multiple ways to skin a cat, basically. Now, some people might hear this and think, oh, well, darn it, there's no best way to do it. That's sad, because some people want that magic pill. But really, the results of this study are exciting because they tell you that no matter what tool you find to be the most effective and enjoyable for you, it can be effective at promoting weight loss, which is good. This is very, very, very good. It's also worth mentioning, I wanted to point out that in the course of this study, with the various different macronutrient contents, because of the weight loss, the changes in blood cholesterol levels in these overweight participants, and the changes in things like blood pressure, again, these markers of metabolic syndrome, the effect on these markers was the same across all diets, which again would suggest that fat loss is very important because independent of what you're eating, you can see improvements in these health markers just by promoting a healthier weight. So on that topic of these different macronutrients, we've kind of talked about, the difference in the chemistry and the respiratory quotient and the efficiency of using different fuels. I don't want to go too far deep into the chemistry of it all right now, but I want to just describe briefly the process of cellular respiration. Now, cellular respiration is the process that occurs in the mitochondria of our cells to use the food energy to create ATP. ATP is adenosine triphosphate, and it is considered the energy currency of our body, right? So whenever we move, whenever we are using energy, whenever we're talking, speaking, again, all the energy that we use dividing and multiplying our cells and our DNA, ATP is what actually provides the energy. Cellular respiration gives the energy from our food to the ATP, and then ATP is what gives the energy to these processes so that they can occur. And cellular respiration is very long and very complex. There's different steps and there's different cycles, but it all produces ATP. Now, very briefly, if we are using carbohydrates for cellular respiration to make ATP, it first and foremost will go through a process called glycolysis. And basically what that means is that the glucose molecule will be split in half into two molecules called pyruvates, and that will take a little bit of ATP to perform, but it will provide a net increase of ATP. And then these pyruvates can be converted into something called acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA can then go into something called the Krebs cycle, sometimes called the citric acid cycle, and there's lots and lots of compounds and intermediates. But again, the whole idea of this is that it will charge ATP with a phosphate, and then the bond between that phosphate is what will provide energy to these different processes. Now, a carbohydrate will obviously go through glycolysis, become pyruvate, and then enter the Krebs cycle at that point. But then a fat can actually just enter straight into the citric acid cycle. So a lot of times what will happen is that a fat, because it can't be converted into a glucose or a sugar, what will happen is it will be converted into some intermediate of the citric acid cycle. A common thing to do is acetyl-CoA. Proteins are the same way. Depending on the exact structure of the protein, some proteins will be converted into a sugar carbohydrate and then enter the cellular respiration cycle that way. Some of them are called ketogenic amino acids and will be inserted in the similar way to fats into the cellular respiration, into the Krebs cycle of cellular respiration. And the only reason I want to bring that up, again, is not because I expect you to be familiar with it. Frankly, I am not as familiar with it as I could or perhaps ought to be, but it all is the same. That's the point that I want to get across. Whether it's a carb, whether it's protein, whether it's a fat, they all will just enter this cycle and the energy will be turned into ATP, right? It's not so black and white. There's different levels of efficiencies and all those different things, but the calories, no matter where they come from, are the same. Some of you guys might be tired of hearing me say that by now, but some of you guys need to understand it. Unfortunately, there are too many villains of misinformation out there trying to get rich quick and sell you a magic pill. It's important to me that you guys understand the real science of how this works. Now, with all that said, calories in versus calories out is absolutely true. It is absolutely the mechanism that our bodies use to create our energy and therefore to lose fat, right? If we don't supply enough energy to our bodies with food to perform our calories out, it will draw calories from our body fat stores. Calories in versus calories out is absolutely true, but it's not helpful advice. And that's the thing. Sometimes you see on one hand, you have this person who just preaches that calories in, calories out isn't even true, and it's your hormones and it's ingredients, and that's not productive. It's not true. On the other hand, sometimes you'll have this person, sometimes I see influencers, whoever, and they just come across with an angry tone, and they kind of have this attitude that if you are overweight or obese, it's just because you're not a hard worker and you're not disciplined and it's calories in, calories out and nothing matters, and they're just kind of angry and aggressive. And I don't love that. I hope not to come across that way. I want to be very adamant about what science is actually. But again, just saying calories in, calories out, screaming it at somebody is not helpful. It's not useful, practical advice that somebody can implement. It's the same, for example, as if somebody was in debt. Say that somebody graduated college and they're finally working their job and they're trying to pay off their student loans, and maybe they're asking you for advice, or if you were some financial advisor or somebody, you're like, okay, well, what steps can I take to get out of my student loan debt? And you just screamed at them. You were like, well, you need to spend less money than you earn and use the money left over to pay off your debt. It's like, okay, I think most people understand that. But they're asking for tools. They're asking for strategies, plans of how they can do that. But you're like, just spend less money than you earn and spend less money than you earn, and then you'll get out of student loan debt. It's not that people don't understand that. It's that they struggle with realistic applications of how to make that happen. And so at this point, that is what I want to do for you, is help give you some meaningful tools to do that. Now, the first piece of advice that I would want to give is going to apply differently to different people depending on where they are in their journey, where their starting point is, but it is that of habits. First of all, a lot of things that are sort of, lose 100 pounds in 100 days, and lots of things you see on like magazines is really rapid weight loss goals or programs are not effective, and I don't encourage that anybody tries them out. I really think that most people would be a lot more successful in their weight loss goals if they considered how much progress they're going to make in the course of years rather than months or weeks. And the way that we do that is to find healthy habits that promote our movement in the direction that we hope to go. Now, as I said, depending on where you are, you might have some of these habits formed already. You might be, in a middle stage of this. But what I want to do is describe the process of habit forming that I would recommend to somebody who is obese and has very poor diet habits and has very poor exercise habits, and then how I would take them from where they are, slowly making habits to where they want to be. Now, again, say we have somebody who is very overweight, has very, very low levels of physical activity, and has very, very unhealthy diet. They are really starting from ground zero, but they're trying to improve. The first thing that I would want them to do is just add into their diet and add into their routine a little bit of healthy habits. So, for example, for their diet, I wouldn't even start by having them try to restrict anything. I wouldn't. I would say, all I want you to do for your diet right now is to increase your consumption of fruits and vegetables. That's it. That's all I would have them do. I don't want them to take anything out of their diet yet. I just want them to put fruits and vegetables into their diet. And then perhaps they eat exactly what they do, plus some fruits and vegetables. But I think in a lot of cases, if they do stay on top of eating their fruits and vegetables, those will kind of take the place of some of the other foods that are in their diet. And then I wouldn't say, hey, I want you to go start this resistance training and high intensity interval training routine 6 days a week. I would say, I just want you to go on a walk for 15, 20, maybe 30 minutes a day, just a super low intensity walk. And that's it. Those are the two changes I'd start with. Add fruits and vegetables and add a brief walk. And I would want that person to do that until it's a habit, until they're used to eating fruits and vegetables every day. It's just what they do. And then they go on a brief little walk after lunch each day. It's just what they do. At that point, it's a habit, and we can then add on to it and continue to make better habits. So at that point, they're used to eating fruits and vegetables. What I would probably do is have them cut back on their portion sizes a little bit. Now, depending on what they eat, that might not be the case. Maybe the best thing to do, depending on the person, is to cut back on the types of unhealthy foods that they're eating because they're so hyperpalatable and they don't fill them up. But I think in a lot of cases, it would be good to just have the person eat a little bit less of what they do now. I think that's a very useful tool. So they're eating fruits and vegetables, and now they're eating a little bit less. And then if the person was used to going on their 10, 15-minute walk, perhaps the next step I would do is to have them go on a 20, 30-minute walk at this point. And then I might add a little bit of resistance training. But it doesn't need to be bodybuilder type training, powerlifter type training. I just want them to be intentionally using their muscles for some sort of exercise. So again, depending on the weight and the abilities of the person, it could just simply be like a box squat, sitting down and standing up off a box or a chair. It could be high knees. It could be using some light dumbbells to do some rows and some curls and some shoulder presses. Again, very low intensity, very sort of beginner level. But again, at this point, I want them to do both of these new habits until they are habits. At this point, now that this is a habit, they're continually eating less food than they used to. They're eating more fruits and vegetables, and they have sort of a structured exercise program that's going on maybe 3, 4, 5 days a week. Then when this is a habit, that's when I want to start changing the foods that they eat. For some people, it can be tricky. Some people have an initial aversion to healthy alternatives of foods. But what I want to try and do is take the foods that they already enjoy eating and just make little tweaks. So for example, replace their bread with a whole grain bread. And if they're making meatballs or lasagna or things like that, or if they're having a really fatty ribeye steak, I just want to change it out for a leaner ground beef, a leaner cut of steak that they're more used to eating. A big change I really, really like to make for people that some people really get mad at me for wanting them to try and make, some of my clients, is trading out your cooking oils for a spray oil. Now, some people have an aversion to that. They think that, these processed foods are bad for you, and, spray oil is not, it's not close enough to its original source to be good. And to that, I understand. I don't agree with you. It's not bad for you to have spray oils. Seed oils is a whole topic right now, and it's a topic that I can get into in a later episode. I'm not going to do it now. in shorts, they're fine for you. Don't worry about it. But if that's the case, then it's going to be a little more money, but I might encourage them to get a spray olive oil or avocado oil that, might be considered a little more holistic. Just because when you're using straight oil or straight butter, it really kind of takes a lot to get the pan covered evenly when you're cooking, and it just increases your calories by quite a bit. Anyways, in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is that I would, at this point, start to change the types of food that they're eating. And then in terms of their exercise, I would increase their intensity of what they're already doing. So perhaps if they were doing some, easy resistance training, I might increase the weight or the types of exercise so that they are a little more challenging, not anything crazy, hopefully, but they have to push themselves a little more. Maybe instead of going on a walk, they go on a brisk walk or a jog. And then I hope from here you guys are able to kind of see how this is going to scale. At this point, we're going to probably track their calories and restrict types of food. We're going to change the structure of their meals completely. We're going, at this point, you can start to make radical changes. But the point is that if you take someone who is very obese and has no interest or experience with exercise, and immediately you change them from Pop-Tarts and McDonald's and full sugar soda to just salads and chicken breast and super long 2-hour workouts in the gym and long runs, not only are they probably going to not do very well at it, they're probably just going to give up, and you've done nothing really productive for them. I want to install these very small habits very gradually. Now, the next piece of advice that I would give, and it kind of goes hand in hand with what I've just talked about, is to avoid a crash diet. I've never heard an instance of a crash diet going well ever. And of course, when you start it, you don't know it's a crash diet. I don't think most people go into it and say, I'm going to start a crash diet. But a crash diet is called that because it's such an extreme restricting diet that people just don't stick to it. Now, a goofy example, I find it goofy, but it was a real big thing, I think in the 50s and 60s, was something called the cabbage soup diet. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It was a diet where people could eat nothing but cabbage soup. It was primarily marketed towards women who were supposed to be skinny and thin and not weigh very much for their husbands, and it was incredibly restrictive. Not only was it restricting, a certain macronutrient, it was excluding all types of food except for cabbage soup all the time, which is, first of all, you're probably going to be deficit in a lot of micronutrients. Second of all, you're getting very little, if any at all, protein in your diet, and then you're just not going to stick to it. You're going to rebound. And I think a lot of the issue with these crash diets too is people don't realize that they failed because the diet is so poorly designed, and they think that they fail because they are not good enough at dieting, and they give up and they think that being healthy is just not for them. Now, the next thing I would recommend is to consume things like whole foods. I think the benefits of eating whole foods, whole grains, fruits, and vegetables are incredible, just because they have things like fiber, they have vitamins and minerals, and even beyond that, they have things called phytochemicals, which are just chemicals found in plants. That's what phyto means. But these phytochemicals are often cancer protective. They're antioxidants. They can be very, very, very good for you. And I encourage lots of people to eat them for their health, but as well as when we're eating more fiber and we're eating more protein, as I've already discussed, we're going to feel more full. There's another style of eating called volumetrics, which has to do with the volume of food. And basically what it means is to try and focus on eating foods. Usually it means they have a high water content, again, like fruits and vegetables. Popcorn is kind of a thing because it has big volume, although when you chew it and swallow it, it ends up not taking quite as much space. But the idea with volumetrics is that I believe the idea is that it's supposed to have more grams per serving than it has calories. I'm not exactly sure on that, but I hope you get the idea. It's supposed to be sort of a bigger portion of food with less calories in it. And usually That is obtained by eating things like produce that have a high water content. Sometimes it can also mean eating a lean protein like a chicken breast. And then the last thing, this is again kind of anecdata. It's just a piece of advice that I would give you, but I found it something that's very useful for me, is when I have a plan and I write it out. One thing that I used to do that I got very kind of tired and stressed out of was that I would track my calories every single day. And I mean, it worked. I was conscious of what I was eating and I was able to manipulate my body weight doing that. The only thing was that to weigh out and measure and scan barcodes and find foods on my calorie tracking app for every single food I eat every single day, it just got to be a lot of work. And some people don't find that to be a problem. And if not, that's great. But I kind of did find it to be a little just fatiguing. So what I did that I found helped me very much is that I would, do that same process, count calories, track the foods that I was going to eat in my app, but then I would do it once. And I'd write that full day of eating down on a chart, make sure that my nutrient levels were met and make sure that it was ideal for calories and fiber and protein. And then I'll write that full day of eating out and I hang it up on my fridge. And then every day, some people don't like eating like this, granted, but every day I'll eat this same exact meal plan. Sometimes I'll have, 2 or 3 different meal plans. Usually my breakfast and lunch are the same because I enjoy eating that way. It's simple. I don't get sick of the same foods. But it just takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. I don't have to track it every single day because it's already been tracked. So I can just eat what I've written down on this sheet of paper on my fridge and know that my nutrition is where it ought to be. The last piece of advice I'm going to give you about fat loss before we transition into the muscle gain phase of this podcast is that consistency is more important than everything. Consistency is the most important thing. If you could pick any diet, no matter how effective the diet is at stimulating weight loss, if you are not able to stick to it consistently, it is not going to work. Now, you are going to be the product of what you do most of the time. And the issue is that some people will, really just have very bad diet habits throughout the week, but then they're, Friday for lunch I had a spinach salad, and I had like low fat yogurt this week too instead of full fat yogurt. And that's good. Those are good steps, but it's a very small fraction of all of the eating that you did throughout the week. It is not going to really do anything if you can't stick to it consistently. And the example that I wanted to share with you guys here is that of my older sister. I don't know if she listens to this podcast, so maybe she's going to hear that I shouted her out. Maybe not. But my older sister, she is a paraplegic, which just means that she is paralyzed. She cannot move or feel from her waist down. So, of course, she's in a wheelchair. And because of that, she has very real challenges for controlling her weight, right? She eats the same as everybody, but her calories out, especially her non-exercise activity, is really pretty low. And in fact, in a lot of ways, because of the disconnect in the nerves from the brain and the spinal cord to the legs, that can even decrease your basal metabolic rate. And it's presented to her some really difficult circumstances to try and control her body weight. But she has been trying really, really, really hard to stick with it and to get healthier and to lose weight. And I want to say now she's been working on her weight loss journey for probably 2, maybe 3 years. And I think she's lost probably 30 pounds by now, which is substantial. This is a great difference for her, and it's going to improve her metabolic health in many, many ways. But the reason I bring that up is because 30 pounds, though substantial, when considered over the course of 2 to 3 years, is like half a pound a week, which is, for most people, like visually, there's no change week to week. And for many people, it is incredibly discouraging. In fact, some people do better with a faster weight loss that's more calorie restricted because they can see those physical changes in their body composition, in the ways that their clothes fit, and that's motivating to them. Now, my sister has gone so slow and steady, but she's done it super consistently for years now. And because of that, because she's been patient and consistent with her diet, she is in a much better place now than she was before. And I think she is a wonderful, wonderful example. Now, before we move on to exercise, I apologize. There is, just in the past couple of days since I wrote out what I wanted to talk about for my podcast, a couple things that I wanted to discuss. Sort of caveats to, not caveats, but things that perhaps are important to be aware of when it comes to losing body fat. The first thing was a study I wanted to talk about. This study was from 2010 out of the University of Rhode Island, and it's called The Effect of Moderate Intensity Resistance Training During Weight Loss on Body Composition and Physical Performance in Overweight Older Adults. So resistance training, it's a term I've used a few times in this podcast by now. Basically, it means some sort of strength training, but the resistance can come from a variety of things. Typically, it comes in the form of a weight. It can come in the form of a weight machine. It can come in the form of an elastic band, but you're using your muscles to overcome some sort of resistance. Now, in this study, it was a 10-week study, and they had 31 volunteers who were initially selected, and then they had a few drop out. So it ended up being a cohort of 27 subjects in this 10-week trial, and they assigned them to two groups. So both groups consumed the same diet. It's called the DASH diet, which DASH stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension, which is high blood pressure. And so they had these two groups. One group consumed the DASH diet, and that was their only intervention. The other group consumed the same DASH diet, as well as they performed resistance training. Now, to be a subject in this study, you had to be either overweight or obese. This study did include men or women, but they were aged 60 to 75 years who were not recently engaged in a regular exercise program, which sadly is pretty common, pretty simple to find. Older people who have not in the last 6 months been engaged in a regular exercise program. Now, anyways, these individuals in this study, let's see. Here we are. They both lost weight throughout the course of this 10-week study. The thing is that the study was not isocaloric. Isocaloric means that calories were the same. And of course, calories are really our big dictator for weight loss. So we love to see studies that are isocaloric. This one was not. They did not account for that, but rather they just taught the same diet to the individuals in each group. Anyways, the starting average weight for these participants was 87 kilograms on average, which is about, I believe, 190 pounds. So I think for, their old age, of course, a lot of people lose lean mass at this point. That is considered overweight and obese, of course, because they had to be to participate in this trial. But they measured the amount of weight loss and fat loss for each of these groups in kilograms. And the difference between these two groups, the one that resistance trained and the one did not, was incredible. So on average, the group that resistance trained lost 3.5 kilograms of body weight, 4 kilograms of fat, and then they gained about 1 kilogram of lean mass. So in this 10 weeks, they gained a little bit of muscle, lost a substantial portion of adipose tissue, for a net change of about 3 kilograms of weight loss, which is incredible. That is super, super desirable to gain lean mass and lose body fat. And they did that very, very well. Now, the group that did not resistance train and they only performed the diet, they actually lost about 2 kilograms, and almost all of this was lean tissue, which, frankly, if you were to perform a weight loss regimen and you're overweight or obese, and all of the weight you lost was lean mass, this would almost be undesirable. I would rather have somebody weigh more because of lean mass, because again, that's going to give you more cell structure to absorb, nutrients. You're less likely to become insulin resistant. You're more likely to be able to move and stand up on your own. They lost looks like from this graph, a quarter or so, less than half a kilogram of fat mass was lost for this group in this study, which is not ideal at all. And I bring this up just because I want to highlight the importance of resistance training. That's something that we're going to talk about in the next part of this podcast. And I just worry that some of you will think, oh, I'm not an athlete. I'm not trying to be a bodybuilder or a power lifter. So resistance training and increasing muscle size does not matter for me. I hope to impress upon you that it does. It does matter. And that adding resistance training to your weight loss regimen, even if it doesn't mean you get much stronger or much more muscle, we can see from this study that it will just let our weight loss be what we want it to be. It will let our weight loss be primarily from fat and not from muscle. In some cases, we'll even gain muscle and lean tissue during our weight loss, which is incredibly desirable. Now, the next, again, not caveat, but thing to be aware of that I wanted to discuss here is about pregnancy and breastfeeding. This, again, was not something I intended to talk about as I was initially writing out what I hope to talk about in this podcast, but I recently took on a new client who is a breastfeeding mother. And it was funny, actually. We got, our initial email correspondence and things. I asked her some questions about her health and fitness habits and what she does now. And it never came up until we were on our Zoom call with each other. She says, oh, by the way, I am breastfeeding still. Does that change anything? And I kind of had to laugh and scratch my head. I said, yeah, absolutely, it changes anything. And I need to probably become more aware of how that changes things so that I can give you a good idea for what to do. So recently I've been diving into the research, reading my nutrition textbooks about what sort of strategies and calorie output is placed on the body by means of pregnancy and breastfeeding. And fortunately, it was relatively simple. Again, this is a manipulating body composition episode, so I'm not going to speak currently on the micronutrient, the vitamin and mineral requirements of pregnancy and breastfeeding. However, when you are pregnant, it is beneficial to gain weight. It is beneficial to gain weight. During the first trimester of pregnancy, it's common to gain about 1 to 4 pounds, so not even really much at all. But then in your second and third trimesters, it is encouraged, healthy, beneficial to the baby for you to gain about 1 pound per week. And the current nutrition protocols say that the mother should aim to consume about 350 calories above what her maintenance calories are to achieve this change. Now, you might remember, just briefly ago in this episode, I said that 500 calories per day was the deficit that we want to lose 1 pound per week of fat. But now I'm saying that 350 calories is what we want to increase to gain a pound of weight. And the reason for that is simply because when we're growing in pregnancy, when you're gaining that 1 pound, it is not just body fat, so it's a little different. In fact, I'd hope to talk about this just briefly to encourage mothers. Some mothers are unfortunately scared and really try to minimize the amount of weight that they gain during a pregnancy. But if you begin a pregnancy at a healthy body weight, it is encouraged, it is optimal for you to gain about 25 to 35 pounds during your pregnancy. In fact, even if you are overweight or obese, you still ought to gain weight during pregnancy. You should not try and encourage fat loss during pregnancy, and you should gain 10 to 15 pounds, even if you are overweight or obese during your pregnancy. Now, for a healthy woman, actually, let me insert this here. If you are underweight and you are not of a healthy weight, so you're below that healthy weight when you get pregnant, you should gain 35 to 40 pounds during your pregnancy for the optimal health of the baby. Now, again, going off of a healthy woman who's gaining 25 to 35 pounds during a pregnancy, that comes in a variety of ways. Now, the first portion of that is, of course, probably about 8 pounds, 6 to 8 pounds is going to be the baby itself. That's very obvious that we gain weight in that way. But then we're also going to gain 4 to 6 pounds just in the increase of breast and uterine tissue. Right, of course, your uterus as a woman is going to grow to encapsulate this large baby. That is an increase in tissue. Your breast tissue grows in preparation for breastfeeding the baby. That is going to account for about 4 to 6 pounds. You also are going to increase the amount of blood supply you have in your body so that you can properly nourish the baby. That is about a half a gallon of blood, which is 4 pounds. Your amniotic fluid is going to weigh 1 to 2 pounds. Your placenta is going to weigh about a pound. And then on top of all of those things, you will gain about 4 to 8 pounds is healthy of body fat tissue. Now, after pregnancy, after you give birth to the baby, you're going to pretty immediately lose, well, not pretty, you are immediately going to lose by means of the baby, the amniotic fluid, and the placenta, about 10 to 12 pounds. And then the rest of it, you should aim to lose about a pound per week for 4 to 6 months, depending on how much weight you gained. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, though, and really a beneficial tool for mothers, is that breastfeeding burns, on average, 600 to 800 calories per day. Now, specifically, it burns about 200 calories per day per cup of breast milk that you produce. Now, the mother's body is very adaptive to the amount of breast milk that it will produce. This is why mothers are able to adequately breastfeed twins or even triplets, is because their body will adapt and make as much as is demanded. Now, it's pretty hard to find out exactly how much breast milk the baby drinks each day unless you are pumping and bottle feeding. In that case, you could figure out exactly the volume in cups of breast milk that you feed to your baby each day. But assuming that most people are just going to feed their baby directly and not know, it is common for mothers to nurse their baby about 3 to 4 cups of milk per day, burning about 600 to 800 calories per day. Now, of that 200 calories per cup, about 150, 160 of those calories come from the breast milk itself, right? I mean, same as cow's milk has calories in it from the fat and carbohydrates and protein, so does breast milk. So those calories are going to come from somewhere, but then the rest of those calories, those 40, 50 calories remaining of that 200 are going to come from actually the hormones and the enzymes and everything, the communication between the brain and the breast to create the milk, as well as the energy of creating the milk. So again, about 150 come from the milk itself and 50 come from the production of that milk. Now, at that point, you are burning 600 to 800 calories above maintenance. If your maintenance calories are 2,000 at your post-pregnancy weight, but then you're breastfeeding, you're actually burning about 2,600 or 2,800 calories per day. Now, with that, if we're assuming a pretty modest weight loss pattern of about 500 calorie deficit, 1 pound per week, like I've described, you actually might need to eat above what your maintenance calories would be at your weight. So, for example, you'd probably want to eat 21 to 2,300 calories per day to maintain that 500 calorie deficit. So, basically what I'm trying to say is that it is very healthy to gain weight during pregnancy. I know that some women are averse to that idea, but there is kind of a built-in method for mothers to recover from that weight gain after pregnancy of breastfeeding. Now, hypothetically, you could eat in a caloric deficit still and have like 1,000 calorie deficit. Hypothetically, you could just get a breast pump and pump incredible amounts of breast milk to just burn extra calories, but I don't recommend that. It's a cool thing to think about, but I don't recommend it just because breast milk contains a lot of micronutrients. You are the source of all of the vitamins and minerals that your baby needs, and if you are not getting them in your diet, then they're going to pull them from your nutrient stores, and when your nutrient stores run out, the baby's just not going to be properly nourished as it should be. So again, that's why I don't recommend a super fast weight loss, while you're breastfeeding, just because the less calories you're eating, the harder it's going to be to eat the proper amount of micronutrients to support you and the baby. As well as osteoporosis, we probably all know, is much more common in women because of estrogen and postmenopause that can affect your bone health. But during pregnancy and breastfeeding, if you're not eating enough calcium, especially, your body will literally just pull the calcium from your bones. The baby will get the calcium it needs, don't get me wrong, but it will take that calcium from your bones, which increases your risk of osteoporosis in the future. And that's obviously not ideal. Now, I'd like to take a quick break and thank the sponsors of today's episode. Now, unfortunately, I'm kidding. I did the same thing in episode 1. I do not have any sponsors for this program. I put on this podcast with my own time and with my own money just because I have a goal of putting forth valuable, high-quality, scientific communication about nutrition and exercise. And I do promise you that if ever this show does contain sponsors, that they will only be sponsors that I personally use, super duper trust, and would genuinely recommend to those who are interested in supporting this podcast by purchasing those brands and those products. I will produce this podcast on my own as long as I need to keep that value intact. That being said, I do want to describe some ways to you at this point that you can support this podcast and support my efforts in this scientific communication. If my goal of providing this scientific communication resonates with you, if you are gaining value out of the things that I am teaching you in this podcast about manipulating body composition in today's episode, I please ask that you would support the podcast in these ways. The first thing that you can do is subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you listen, whether that's on YouTube or Apple Podcasts or Spotify. On Apple and Spotify, you can leave this show up to a 5-star review. On YouTube, you can like this episode. You can leave comments on the episode. I would ask that if you have any questions, you leave them in the comment section on YouTube. All of those things really help push forth this podcast to a greater audience of people who might enjoy the content that I am learning and will help support my goal of providing the scientific communication. You can also share this episode or the show directly with a friend or family member who you think would benefit from it. Perhaps if you send somebody an episode about how to manipulate your body composition and lose fat, they might take a little bit of offense from it, but perhaps you could share the show with them today to someone that you think might enjoy listening to the content that I am putting forth. As well as you can support this podcast by working with me as a coach. Now, I hope to just provide you guys all the tools and information that you need to be successful on your own. But one thing that I will say is that the consistency, the diet adherence, and the specific tools and strategies based on your situation to facilitate weight loss and muscle gain can be very tricky to figure out. If you'd like to work with me directly, of course, this is not a zero-cost way to support this podcast. I do charge for my services, but that would be a terrific way to support this podcast and figure out your own nutrition and exercise goals yourself. With that said, I thank you for listening. I encourage you to support this podcast in zero-cost ways as much as you can and are willing to. And with that, we will go back into the rest of this episode. And at this point, we are transitioning to the conversation of muscular hypertrophy. The suffix trophy, T-R-O-P-H-Y, literally spells trophy, like a trophy that you win. But that has to do with the synthesis of tissue. For those of you who are familiar with medical terminology, the prefix A, literally just the letter A, means that there is nothing occurring. So, for example, apnea, the letter A, and then apnea. Sleep apnea, right, is the absence of breathing in your sleep. And in this case, atrophy could mean the absence of cell synthesis of the muscles, which means that the muscles shrink. Atrophy means the muscles shrink. Hypertrophy means that there is a big increase in the amount of synthesis and the muscle tissue will grow. Muscular hypertrophy. We're talking about how to get bigger muscles. Now, the first thing that I would like to discuss in this regard is the 3 different types of training adaptations that we can incur. They are strength, size, and endurance. Now, when we are training, of resistance training, whenever we're resistance training, our brain sends electrical impulses through our nerves to tell our muscles to contract and perform the function that they're supposed to. And then our blood will provide those muscle cells with the nutrients and the energy that they need to perform those tasks, and they will carry away metabolites and waste products from the muscle. Now, strength is going to affect the brain and the nerves. Hypertrophy is going to be an adaptation of the muscle cells themselves, and endurance is going to be an adaptation of our blood and our ability to remove metabolites and provide fuel to the muscles. So commonly, if you were to be training for strength, you would train relatively low reps. Usually 6 reps or less is common for just increasing maximum strength. So when we train in those lower reps, it actually kind of teaches our brain to be more effective and more powerful in sending electric signals through our nerves to our muscles. So you can actually get stronger just because your brain and your nerves are better, not necessarily because your muscles even grew, which is pretty neat. Of course, the next thing is muscular hypertrophy itself. Usually this is going to be within the 6 to 12 rep range, although you can achieve muscular hypertrophy in a much broader range than that, but usually that's what's prescribed, is something between 6 and 12 reps. And when we train in that range, it is more so our muscles that are taking on the load. And what happens in that rep range is our muscles are able to sense mechanical tension, which is just our muscles are being pulled. And because of mechanical tension, it sends signals to the nuclei of the muscle cells that they should multiply, and they should create a new nucleus, create new cells, and increase the amount of contractile proteins, which are actin and myosin within the sarcomeres. Again, this is a lot of physiology for people who don't understand. But basically, the mechanical tension from lifting in this rep range will signal to the muscles that they need to divide and grow. And that leads to muscular hypertrophy. And then lastly, when we train for endurance, usually this is 15 reps or more. Sometimes 15 reps can accomplish muscular hypertrophy, so maybe it's 20 reps or more, but really it's this high rep stuff will improve your endurance. And it will improve your endurance usually by something called angiogenesis. And angiogenesis means the creation of vasculature or blood vessels. So you will actually grow new veins and venules and arterioles, and usually you want to actually grow like new major arteries, but you will increase the amount of capillaries that are reaching your cells, which again is going to help you be more efficient at providing fuel for this long-term exercise activity that you're doing, as well as become more efficient at reducing the metabolites in your cell. Now, when we exercise, we release free hydrogens into the muscle cell, which are acidic, and that usually contributes to the burn. I don't want to go into this in much detail right now, lactic acid is commonly a culprit, a considered culprit, and it's still something we hear. It's something that I believed up until probably a year or so ago when I learned about this science. But lactic acid or lactate is actually a prevention measure for the acidity, the acidosis of our muscle cells. And so when we are fatigued and we do have a high metabolite content in our muscles, we do see, lactate. But the lactate is not what is causing our fatigue. It is actually one of the things that is trying to recover our bodies from fatigue. But there are other metabolites, and really just the increase in the acid content, the decrease in the pH of our muscle cells will cause that burning sensation, and we get more effective at reducing that when we train for endurance, when we have more blood supply, and so on. Now, strength and endurance training are very, very cool things, but they are not for the purpose of this podcast, because today all we are talking about is body composition, which is manipulated by our muscle size. Now, the next thing I want to describe is the benefit of, really this is from an aesthetic standpoint, but when we gain muscle, it changes our body fat percentage. Now, you guys are probably familiar with a body fat percentage, and lower body fat percentages mean that, your six-pack and your muscles are more visible, and that is often very desirable for many people. And of course, one way to manipulate your body fat percentage is to decrease the amount of body fat you have, and then that will decrease your body fat percentage. However, the other way that you can decrease your body fat percentage is to increase your amount of muscle. Now, obviously, if you're trying to get a six-pack for summer, you should not try to accomplish this by increasing the amount of muscle you have, right? At that point, you would need to use fat loss as your tool. But I actually consider myself a decent example of this. I have been working out really hard, really consistently for about 8 years now, since I was in high school. I've gotten pretty strong. I have a decent amount of muscle on my frame. At this point, and especially in the more recent winter months, I had a pretty decent amount of fat on my frame too. In fact, I would say that I had enough fat on my frame that if you were to take it and put it on somebody who did not have very much muscle, they would look to be pretty out of shape, pretty overweight. But the benefit on my part is that because I have developed a decent level of musculature over the years as well, my body fat percentage is not quite as high as it would be because of the additional muscle I have. So especially, in my arms and shoulders and legs, it's very easy to tell that I do have a good bit of musculature. I look better than I would if I did not have that amount of muscle. Now, that being said, as I've already described, we're going into summer. I'm trying to decrease my body fat percentage. I enjoy bodybuilding. I have plans to compete in bodybuilding, though I have not yet. And by so doing, I need to decrease my level of adipose tissue. I can't just decrease my body fat by growing bigger muscles at this point, right? That would, of course, hypothetically decrease my body fat percentage, but not to a meaningful amount in the way that I could control it by losing body fat. Anyways, that just could be another motivation for somebody to resistance train, is because it will improve your body composition, your body fat percentage, in addition to all of the long-term health benefits that we have already described. Now, you might be asking yourself, what should I focus on with my goals? This is going back to the strength, size, and endurance. A lot of people don't have a goal to just get as big and as huge as possible, right? That is my goal. I want to get as big arms and chest and shoulders as I possibly can. But many people, when they think of their end goal of their muscular development and their training, their end goal is not to be a bodybuilder. It's just they want to be more functionally strong, perhaps to, lift a couch or carry around their kids. They want to have, better abilities to move around and play with their kids. Very, very good goals, and that just don't involve muscular hypertrophy. Now, this is what I mean when I say you might be asking what you should focus on: size, strength, endurance. And again, of course, we're talking about muscular size, how to increase your muscular size. And I just want to interject here that I think everybody should focus on, at least for a small portion of their lives, hypertrophy, strictly hypertrophy training. Just for the sake of time and for health. We've already talked about the health benefits of hypertrophy training and having more muscle size, but when I talk about time, I want to bring up my older brother. My older brother, he's pretty different from he works in cybersecurity. He is a very, very, very smart guy. We have different personalities. He's not been into athletics and sports so much as I have. But we have conversations all the time. He teaches me about cybersecurity and how I can make my password stronger, and I teach him about nutrition and exercise. We've had several conversations. Again, I don't know if my brother listens to this podcast, same as I don't know if my sister does. I believe my brother's wife listens to this, so perhaps she'll hear this and share it with him. But my older brother and I have had conversations about muscular hypertrophy. My older brother, he's a few inches shorter than me. He is probably about 160 pounds, whereas I weigh about 215 pounds. And for years, I've been encouraging him to adopt a hypertrophy-based strength plan or muscle building plan, resistance training plan is what I mean to say, similar to the one that I use personally. And his response has been one that many people kind of share is, that's not my goal. I don't want to get bulky. I don't want to get big muscles. I don't want to look like a bodybuilder. That's not my goal, so I don't want to train the way that you train. To that, I understand. I understand that that's not your goal. But again, remember what I said just moments ago. I have been training really, really hard, really, really consistently for 8 years. Now, I am pleased with the amount of musculature that I have developed. I feel good about my size and my strength. I'm proud of the results that I've made so far. I don't even consider myself to be super huge, though. And let's think about, from my brother's perspective, let's say that he trained really hard and really consistently, exactly the same way that I've trained for 8 years, but he trained that way for 1 year. He's not going to get as big as I have. I have been training with the goal to get as big as possible, and it's taken me 8 years to get to where I am now. If he were to adopt that same training regimen for 1 year, he might reach his muscle goal in that first year and then be able to just maintain and focus on strength and endurance like his goal is. I am hoping that this makes sense to you. You understand what I'm trying to get across. My point is, he says he doesn't want to get as big as I am. I understand. So what he should not do is train very hard and very consistently in the way that I have trained for 8 years. But if he were to do that for 1 year, he might be able to reach his goal relatively quick, right? So perhaps his goal and musculature would take him 8 years to develop if he trained in just some other way, right? If he just used some more endurance, athleticism, strength-based program, maybe he would reach his final goal in 8 years. But don't you think it would be a beneficial use of your time to reach that goal in 1 year and then be done? That is the point that I am trying to get across. So that is why I recommend some sort of resistance and hypertrophy training to everybody, in addition to the health benefits that we have already discussed. Now, as we are trying to induce hypertrophy, I've already talked about the rep scheme that we will use, but the other difference between that and strength training is that for a hypertrophy standpoint, what you want to do is put the muscle in a relatively disadvantaged position. That way, you're getting the maximal stretch and tension and stimulus to the muscle that you possibly can. If you're training for strength, as I've described powerlifting before, a powerlifter wants to put his muscles, his limbs, his bones in such a way that he can lift as much weight as possible. He wants to use all the mechanical advantage that he can. He wants to make sure that his moment arms are short as possible so that he can lift as much weight as possible because he is training for strength. When we're training for hypertrophy, it's kind of the opposite. We might want a longer moment arm to put more of a stress and attention on a certain muscle, to bias a certain muscle. Again, you might need to kind of work with a coach or find some sort of exercise guide from me or who else have you to kind of figure out what this means for you. But basically, in a nutshell, what I can say is don't ego lift. Now, I understand that ego lifting is fun. I like to do it myself. But when I say ego lifting, really, I just mean I like to power lift. I like to lift heavy weights where I put my muscles in an advantageous point to lift a lot of weight. But if you are seeking to do hypertrophy, you want to get a big stretch. You want to use a big range of motion. You want to have a big moment arm that puts a lot of tension on the muscle, all the opposite things of strength. In terms of range of motion, the optimal range of motion for muscle growth, there was a systematic review that I came across, read, I enjoyed the information that it put forth. It is a systematic review of the effects of range of motion on muscle hypertrophy. If you remember from episode 1 of the podcast, a systematic review, similar to a meta-analysis, and basically is a book report of sorts. It looks at a number of different studies and tries to come to a consensus of the results of those studies. This was published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. It has a copyright of 2023 and actually came out of 2 universities in Brazil and also in conjunction with Brad Schoenfeld at Lehman College in New York. It's easier for a systematic review to go across multiple campuses and multiple professors because it's kind of just them coming together and discussing the research that has already been published. Again, I hope that this doesn't make it sound like I'm making fun of the type of research, because I'm not at all. But a systematic review is kind of like writing a book report. So in this study, they went over 11 different studies that all studied range of motion and muscle hypertrophy as described by the title. And in these 11 studies, most of them studied muscle hypertrophy of the legs, of the rectus femoris, of the vastus lateralis, something on the quads with the leg extension or a squat. And the next most common muscle was the tricep, usually with something like an overhead tricep extension. Now, of these 11 studies that they talked about, they were either studies that compared a partial range of motion to the full range of motion, or they compared 2 different partial ranges of motion, I should say. But what that means is they had either a initial partial range of motion or a final partial range of motion. So each of that is going to be just half the rep rather than full range of motion. I think everybody knows what full range of motion means for any given muscle group. But for the partials, it could either be the top half or the bottom half. Now, for different muscles, that is going to be perhaps a little confusing for which is which, and just because different motions happen in different directions. But basically, the initial range of motion is the half of the range of the motion where the muscle is lengthened. So, for example, if you are going to be doing a squat, your quad muscles are going to be the most lengthened when your knee is all the way bent at the bottom of the rep. So even though when you think about it, you're doing a squat, you start the range of motion with your legs straight. The start range of motion for the exercise is when you are starting the concentric, where you are lifting the weight. So they could either compare full range of motion to either initial or final partial range of motion, or they could compare initial versus final partial range of motion. And basically, the takeaway for this is that the final partial range of motion is never better. Now, for all the different muscles that could be exercised in the body, there's different nuances, and everyone has different bone lengths and moment arms and all those different things. So studies always report averages, and it's good that they report averages. It gives us a good idea of what the average person should do to achieve the best results. However, there could be, individual variabilities. But from the 11 studies that they went over in this paper, the final range of motion, meaning the partial range of motion where the muscle was in the shortest length, meaning like the top of a squat or the top of a bench press or the top of a bicep curl, it was never better. So depending on the muscle, either full range of motion was superior or the initial partial range of motion was better. Now, again, especially in an audio context, that might be a little confusing what I'm trying to say. But basically, what I'm discouraging is a form of lifting I see where people just kind of do partial bits of the exercise. Basically, they don't get the muscle as lengthened. Usually people enjoy lifting this way because they can go heavier. For example, if you were to do a squat, the powerlifting rules for a squat is that your hip joint needs to pass below the level of your knee joint. So it's a pretty deep squat actually, but many people will do very, very minimal range of motions. They only get their knee to a 90-degree angle. They don't even get their femur parallel to the ground. But they like that because, of course, it's easier to do. I've seen the same thing with shoulder press. People will start the weight, with a straight arm up above their head, and then rather than getting a deep stretch at the bottom where the greatest amount of muscle growth can occur, because that's harder and they can't use as heavy weight, they'll stop kind of halfway and just perform that top half of the rep. And that is not optimal. If your goal is to get super, super strong at a very minimal range of motion, then there you go. That's fine. But if your goal is to grow muscle, as I think many people should focus on for at least some point in their life, either the full range of motion or the partial range of motion where the muscle is most lengthened is going to be the most beneficial. And usually, of course, I will just prescribe the full range of motion. I'm a big proponent of full range of motion. You might be thinking, why would anybody do the partial range of motion where the muscle is most lengthened? Like, why not just do the full range of motion? And this is actually a tactic used by some bodybuilders that you'll see. For example, on the bench press, a lot of people are actually kind of scrutinized and made fun of for it because, for example, if you see a bodybuilder doing a bench press and they don't come all the way up, from a powerlifting standpoint, that doesn't count as a good lift. And, so I guess powerlifters kind of come at that and say that, that doesn't count. You can't actually do that weight for that many reps because they're fake reps. But the bodybuilder's goal is just to grow the muscle. So basically, when you're at the very top, the final range of motion, the moment arm is very, very, very small, which again is why it's easier to perform heavyweight, and some people like to do it for their ego. The moment arm basically is the size of the lever, and when a lever is working against you, you want that lever to be very short to be the most heavy. The longer it is, the heavier it is. So for example, when your elbow joint is further away from your chest at the bottom of a bench press, it is going to be heavier, give more mechanical tension to that muscle. And so sometimes bodybuilders will only press part of the way up so that they can maintain a decent amount of mechanical tension throughout the rep, and they don't waste energy on that top part of the range of motion where they would get more fatigued and tired, and they can spend more of their energy, all of the energy that they have at the bottom where you have that additional amount of tension. So that is going to be my blanket advice for everybody right now. You should probably just do the full range of motion if you wanted to do a partial range of motion as I've described, assuming you understand what exactly I'm trying to say. That might be a good thing for you to try as well. Now, before we move on to the next component of that, I want to add in a caveat on the whole range of motion thing for stretch-mediated hypertrophy. That is a term that some of you may have heard, some of you may have not, but stretch-mediated hypertrophy is just, it's a phenomenon basically where your muscles grow, hypertrophy, because they were just stretched. Now, the idea of mechanical tension, because it is the driver of muscle growth, it is possible and feasible that just stretching the muscle really, really hard could provide that mechanical tension. You don't need to contract the muscle, right? And, well, yes, there has been data to show that this phenomenon may occur, but that a very big condition to that you should know about is that kind of the study that got stretch-mediated hypertrophy off of the ground was actually a study done on chickens. And I haven't read the full manuscript for it, but basically what they did is they took the chickens and then they connected weights onto pulleys and attached those pulleys to the chicken's wings. So that way it would stretch out the chicken's wings and it would stretch out the lats of the chicken. And then I haven't read the paper in hindsight. Maybe I should have for this episode, but I believe is they used an incredible amount of weight and they held the stretch for an incredible amount of time, basically just in a way that it did stimulate hypertrophy, but it's not in a way that any human would really want to replicate, if that makes sense. It would probably be a much better use of your time and a much more comfortable thing to do to just do normal muscle contraction exercise, because you're not going to achieve the stretch-mediated hypertrophy. Now, some people will take the idea of this stretch-mediated hypertrophy and say, well, you need to place more emphasis at the lengthened part of the rep, which we just talked about can definitely be beneficial, but that's just because there's higher amounts of mechanical tension there, which is good, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting stretch-mediated hypertrophy. All that aside, a good stretch on the muscle is definitely conducive to muscle growth. Now, the next thing that's important for us to discuss is just the diet and the protein intake that goes along with resistance training. Now, there are many, many studies that, calculate all different sorts of macronutrient profiles, over the course of a resistance training thing and seeing how they affect. And really, the two most important things are just the amount of calories you consume and your protein intake. One thing I will say is that if you are in sort of a bulking phase, meaning that you are trying to put on muscle without restricting calories, without losing body fat, you have an excess of calories to facilitate the growth of your muscle, that extra food that you're eating, those carbohydrates, are actually going to be protein sparing, meaning that when you're doing an aggressive cut and body fat loss and you're trying to maintain the muscle that you have, there's a good chance that a lot of the protein that you are consuming might actually be converted into forms of glucose that can enter the Krebs cycle and the process of cellular respiration and be used for energy rather than be used for muscle tissue, which is why when somebody is trying to do a fat loss phase and maintain their muscle, they actually, although it seems weird, maybe perhaps counterintuitive, it is actually common for them to ingest more protein than when they're actually trying to grow muscle, just because when you have all the calories you need to grow muscle, the protein that you are eating is more likely to be able to be used for muscle. Now, in terms of the diet and the protein intake that you should have for growing muscle, a very common guideline given, especially in the fitness community, is 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. An important sort of nuance to that is that it should probably be 1 pound or 1 gram of protein per pound of lean body mass. For example, a 300-pound person who is classified as obese probably does not need 300 grams of protein, but that 300-pound person probably has maybe 170, 180 pounds of lean mass, and so they should probably consume that 180 grams of protein. And I quite enjoy the 1 gram of protein per pound of lean body weight during a fat loss phase. I think that's a higher sufficient protein intake. Some people will go a little higher, 1.1, 1.2. Again, when you go really, really higher, especially in that fat loss phase, you really are just kind of using a lot of that for energy, and protein's a lot more expensive grocery-wise than carbohydrates, so it might not be a great idea. But again, because you do want to make sure that you have adequate protein, when some of it is going to inevitably be used for energy, 1 gram per pound of lean mass is a decent guideline, and I would recommend it to most people. If you do not feel like you have a very serious muscle growth goal, you want to grow a little bit of muscle, but it's more just for the health and those sort of reasons that I've already described up until this point, then you could probably go a little lower, probably 0.8 grams per pound. So for example, if you weighed 200 pounds lean, this is just for the sake of math, of course, but that would be 160 grams of protein. I would say that that's probably a good guideline as well for when you are bulking, is that 0.8, or you could perhaps even more simplify it and just say 3/4 of a gram per every pound of lean mass when you are in a bulking phase and you're not restricting calories, or simply if you're just not wanting to, you don't have very strict goals, very crazy goals. Whereas if you are bodybuilder, physique athlete, power lifter, or even really most sorts of athletes who are trying to maintain their muscular power and muscular size while manipulating their body composition and body weight for their sport, you might want to be on the upper end of that. And again, I'd say 1 gram per pound of lean mass. If you're a decent body fat percentage, you can just use your body weight. But 1 gram per pound when you're cutting, and probably 0.8 grams per pound when you are bulking. The next thing I want to talk about when it comes to diet, as it relates to muscle growth, is the ketogenic diet. Again, I do want to talk about that again. I've already mentioned to you that I don't recommend the ketogenic diet to anybody unless they're using it to have some favorable health outcome for some sort of a chronic disease like diabetes. It's just not something I really recommend. If that's something that I had a client who was really, really adamant about and really, really enjoyed, again, I prefer their consistency over anything, and I would want to try and work around that because it's their preference and it's what they're excited about. And there's a lot to say about for a diet that you can get excited about. But one issue with the ketogenic diet in resistance training is that it has been shown to increase levels of SHBG, which is the acronym for sex hormone binding globulin, which is a globulin that binds to sex hormones. Sex hormones are like testosterone, primarily testosterone. Testosterone is a really big driver for muscle growth. And however, there's total testosterone in our blood, and then there is free testosterone. And although you want your total testosterone to be high, if your free testosterone is low, it doesn't really matter how much total testosterone you have. And the thing that binds up most of that testosterone that prevents it from becoming free testosterone is SHBG. Now, you want some SHBG. You don't want all of your testosterone to be free testosterone, or else it wouldn't be transported very far or very long in the blood. But we don't want it to be very elevated either. Just there's low amounts of bioavailable testosterone for our cells to use for the purpose of growth. Granted, again, all things considered, if you can be more consistent on a ketogenic diet and things like that, if you enjoy it, that might just be worth the possibility of that free testosterone level adjusting. But I know for many people, especially in like a bodybuilding or athletic sense, it's valuable for them that testosterone, that free testosterone, be very high. Now, that aside, the thing that I really want to talk about is sort of very tangible performance and training metrics. And so there's a 2018 study that came out of St. Louis University. It is called Low Carbohydrate Ketogenic Diet Impairs Anaerobic Exercise Performance in Exercise-Trained Men and Women, a randomized sequence crossover trial. Now, anaerobic, as was said in this title, basically means high intensity. Aerobic involves oxygen, and if you're doing aerobic exercise, it means that it's not at such a high intensity that you can't breathe fast and enough volume to keep up with your energy demands. Whereas anaerobic is things like sprints and heavy lifting, where you're putting out so much energy so fast that you can't consume enough oxygen, and create enough ATP and energy to support that. Basically, in this study, they discuss how there had been many studies that kind of discuss how a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet it impairs your performance in aerobic exercise, so like endurance running. And that makes sense just because carbohydrate is a quick fuel. And, you'll hear marathon runners or cross-country runners, they carb load on pasta the night before the race so that they have readily available glucose and glycogen stores. But the authors kind of noticed that there was not very much or not very well written studies on the anaerobic exercise performance. I'd love to read for you the introductory paragraph. It says, athletes and other exercise enthusiasts often experiment with energy and or macronutrient restricted dietary practices. The nature of dietary practices and reasons for using restrictive practices vary widely depending on the athlete's goals. A common goal is to reduce total body mass and fat mass without compromising lean mass or exercise capacity. Accomplishing such goals can provide competitive advantages by increasing power to body mass ratio, by allowing an athlete to compete in a lower weight class, by providing more favorable judging in aesthetic sports, or through other effects. Some examples of dietary strategies that have been evaluated in athletes include modest dietary restrictions, high protein intakes, and intermittent fasting strategies, such as time-restricted feeding during which food intake is limited to a few hours each day. Another form of dietary restriction that has become popular among athletes is a very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet. They, of course, discuss the implications that perhaps this ketogenic diet may not be beneficial, but of course they wanted to study it. That's what we do in science. You have a question, you have a hypothesis, and you put it to the test. So what they did is they recruited college athletes who are athletes at St. Louis University, and it was a self-controlled study, meaning that the same participant went in and performed exercise activities either with a high carbohydrate or a lower carbohydrate diet, and then the order was randomized, right? So if you have everybody go in first with the low carb and everyone go in second with the high carb, you just might not get a good idea. There could be other factors involved, and whether fitness level changes or fatigue level changes of why you might see the changes. So you randomize, so half the group does it low carbohydrate first, and half the group does high carbohydrate first, and then you compare the values to get a good idea. They said that the energy content of the 4-day study, I should introduce this. Basically what they did is leading up to their trial, they would eat either the high or the low carbohydrate diet for 4 days. And the energy content of the 4-day diet was matched to the participants' usual diet. So they were isocaloric, right? Whether it was high carb or low carb, they're eating the same number of calories based on the amount of calories that they are used to consuming. It says the low carbohydrate ketogenic diet limited carbohydrate intake to less than 50 grams per day or 10% of total energy intake. The high carbohydrate diet was based on joint recommendations from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the American College of Sports Medicine, and Dietitians of Canada for athletes with high training loads. Accordingly, carbohydrate intake was 6 to 10 grams per kilogram per day. Now, I weigh about 100 kilograms. Of course, probably a lot of these athletes were a little lighter than me, but just again, for the sake of math, if you were to weigh 100 kilograms, that high carbohydrate diet would be 600 to 1,000 grams per day, which is 2,400 to 4,000 calories of carbohydrates per day, meaning that, of course, it was matched to the person's normal energy intake, but that seems like it probably means that the fats were also very low, and hopefully the proteins remain relatively the same. But that is a lot of food. Now, they did 2 tests. The first one was the Wingate anaerobic cycling test, which is basically they hook up a stationary bike to a computer that measures the maximum amount of power output and work performed, basically the amount of force that you can input over 30 seconds. And then they also did, they call it in the study the yo-yo intermittent recovery test. And I was confused. I had never heard of that. Basically, I think it's just the fitness gram pacer test, which I think is something we are all painfully familiar with, the fitness gram pacer test. So they did those 2 trials, and then the results that they got is that on average, when they did the cycling test, the total work done when the students had a high carbohydrate diet was 6% lower, so it was 6% higher in the high carbohydrate diet. When they ate more carbs, they had a 6% higher power output and total work done, and that had a p-value of 0.005. So there was a very significant difference, very noticeable difference between those 2 groups. Then for the fitness gram pacer test, on average, the distance ran was 15% lower after the low carbohydrate ketogenic diet than after the high carbohydrate diet. So again, when they had a high carbohydrate diet, they performed better. The p-value here was 0.02, which is also a very good, statistically significant p-value. You may have remembered from the study that I referenced, the first study in this episode, about the different macronutrient ratios comparing weight loss. They had some biometric measurements that they used to verify whether the weight loss or whether the diet pattern was observed. And for this study, they did the exact same way. In this study, what they actually measured was the pH of the urine. And so when you are consuming less carbohydrates and your body is in ketosis, ketones are actually acidic. And so in someone who's metabolically healthy, that shouldn't provide much of an issue. However, you may have heard of like diabetic ketoacidosis. That is when there are way too many ketones in the blood and the acid is way too much. The pH drops significantly. However, for someone who's healthy, like these college athletes, when the ketones decrease the pH in the blood, the kidneys are able to filter that out, and then it just decreases the pH in the urine, and it keeps the pH of the blood correct, what it's supposed to be. So what they said is that they expect that if someone is truly sticking to this low carbohydrate diet, they would have a lower pH urine, more acidic urine, and that is exactly what they saw. So they were able to know that they adhered to the diet protocols as they were supposed to, and they saw very statistically significant outcomes. I bring that up just to say that you probably want to consume carbohydrates if you are trying to seriously improve your muscular hypertrophy. There's a reason people consume things like caffeine and stimulant-ridden pre-workouts. I noticed that as I say the word ridden there, it makes it sound bad. I am a pre-workout enthusiast, a caffeine enthusiast. I love using those myself. I'm not trying to say that pre-workouts are bad for you. They're not. It's actually, getting off on a side tangent, the upper limit for caffeine in a day is 400 milligrams. Most pre-workouts, most energy drinks only contain 200, sometimes 300. So as long as you are not taking multiple servings per day, you should have no problem with that level of caffeine consumption. The chemicals are not actually bad for you like people think. They're mostly just amino acids, vitamins even. I've seen silly videos of people critiquing energy drinks, and they're like, this has ascorbic acid and cyanocobalamin. Who knows what those even mean? Like, oh, I know exactly what they mean. It's vitamin C and vitamin B12. There's a lot of uneducated people trying to sound smart and confident and spreading misinformation. Anyways, moving on. Ketogenic diet is probably not optimal for hypertrophy. Of course, that being said, as I've already mentioned, studies do report averages. It's totally possible that certain of these students did actually perform better on the day that they ate the low carbohydrate diet. Maybe you feel better when you consume a low carbohydrate diet, and that's just something you are interested in doing. If that's the case, I would recommend that to you, because if you're going to perform better and be more consistent, more excited about that method, it's probably beneficial for you. Now, again, at the end of this episode, I thank you for listening. What I want to hammer in is that consistency is more important than pretty much everything. People will come up to me, whether they're friends or just people in the gym, they say, hey, you look really strong, you have a decent amount of muscle, right? Obviously, they probably don't say it in a term like that. They're probably like, bro, you're huge. But what I mean to say is people will come up and say that, I've made progress that they admire and would hope to seek after. They ask me what I do to achieve the results that I have. And really, the answer is it's not that exciting. I mean, continually, I try and optimize my workout routine. I always try and have the best workout routine I can have to make my progress go better. And I'm happy to share that workout routine with you. I can tell you what I am doing, but really just because you adopt my workout routine doesn't mean you're going to look like me in the near future. Again, I have been working out really hard, really consistently for 8 years. And that's really the secret. You really could do anything. You could take almost any workout split out there, even if it's one that's not technically very optimal for hypertrophy. But if you really gave it a lot of energy, you worked really hard, and you were really consistent at it, you progressively overloaded your lifts, and you did it for 8 years, you would probably get pretty good progress as well. Now, as I talked about that, I realized that I've left out the term progressive overload, and I need to describe that to you, and then we will go over workout splits, as I mentioned, the different types that you could use. Progressive overload pretty much just means that gradually or progressively, you increase the load that you are doing in your workouts. Now, progressive overload is not necessarily the driver of hypertrophy. Like, you don't need to increase the weight to get a stimulus. Whatever weight you're using, if you train it in the right rep range with the right intensity, that is going to give you the stimulus. But the thing about progressive overload is that as you get stronger, as you grow more muscle, using the same weight for the same reps is going to provide less stimulus than it used to because you're stronger, so you need to progressively increase the weights that you're using. A common thing that I will do on my workouts is do like 3 sets of an exercise, say a bench press, and my first set I do 6 reps, and then my second set I usually drop the weight and do 7 reps. My third set I drop the weight again and do like 8 reps. That's called reverse pyramid training, something I really recommend. Basically, you start with your heaviest set, and then each set you increase the reps and decrease the weight. It's a really great tool that I recommend. But anyways, say I'll do that 6, 7, and 8 reps on my 3 sets with certain weights, and I'll do that 1 week, and then I'll just keep trying to add reps to each set. So next week I'll try and do 7, 8, 9. The next week I'll try and do 8, 9, 10, and usually it doesn't happen where I get a rep every single week. But every couple weeks, definitely every month, I'll be able to increase my ability at that lift. And then when I get to the point where I have gone from doing probably 6, 7, 8 to 8, 9, 10, at that point, I'll increase the weight. And then with that heavier weight, I won't be able to do 8, 9, 10. I'll probably be able to do 6, 7, 8. And then I just restart that cycle over and over and over again. Now to the topic of workout splits. There are some very popular ones. I'd say the strengths of them really depend on how many days a week you are able to train. A very common one is called the push-pull legs. So the push muscles are your chest, your shoulders, and triceps. Your pull muscles are your back and your biceps. And then legs, of course, your hamstrings, your quads, your calves, your glutes. And this is really beneficial for people who like working out 6 days a week. You can do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. You do push, pull, legs. And then again on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, you do another push, pull, legs. Then you've hit every single muscle group twice. And all in the course of 1 week, which is a really good frequency to hit the muscle so that they continually are growing. If, however, you can't train 6 days a week, it's not super ideal. Well, obviously, I mean, if you can't train 6 days a week and you try and do a push-pull legs, then you're probably going to be working each muscle group 1 day a week, or just you're going to be doing this, or you're training each muscle with less frequency. Now, the goal with frequency is you want to go to the gym and train the muscle hard enough that you get a good stimulus that it will grow from, as much stimulus as possible to trigger as much growth as possible, but you don't want to do so much that you just get injured and fatigued and sore and you're unable to recover from it. You don't want to do more damage than you can recover from and grow from. So a common thing to do is do a decent intensity, higher volume, lower weights is very common for bodybuilding training, hypertrophy training. And then you have a few days to recover from it, do it again. However, if you only did a push-pull legs, you train each muscle group 1 day a week, you either would have to train really, really, really hard to the point where you're accruing a lot of fatigue to then take a whole week to recover, and then you're just probably leaving some muscle growth on the table. This is actually kind of what I used to do, is just train each muscle group once a week. And what I noticed is that I got good gains from it in the initial stages, and I don't not recommend it. However, I think what was happening is I was getting a lot stronger because I was doing intensity techniques and going to failure. And I think it was my nervous system that needed to recover. And so I was getting stronger, but it wasn't great for hypertrophy. And that's what we're talking about right now. Another common workout split, this is going to be a 4-day per week workout split, is the upper-lower workout split. And that is exactly what it sounds like. One day you work your upper body, then the next day you work your lower body. Again, with 4 days a week, you're probably taking a day off in the middle of the week. Then you're doing upper and lower. Now, the issue with upper and lower workouts is that you're training a lot each workout. Like if you were to train every muscle, then it's long workouts. There's just a lot. Everything's going to be kind of sore and needing to recover after the workout. And maybe that's going to kind of hinder you. If it's what you like, again, consistency is more important than everything. So do it. Do it if you can give it a good energy and you enjoy it. But for me, it's not something that I love to do. Going back to the push-pull legs, I don't even really like to do push-pull legs just because push is good and pull is good. But on your leg day, for me, it's really fatiguing to train both sides of my legs on the same day because they're big muscle groups. So then I'm like all fatigued and tired, and my glutes are tired from squats, but then I have to go and do my deadlifts, and where you also use your glutes, and I'm just really fatigued and I'm trying to lift really strong. Granted, I no longer train my lower body for hypertrophy just because it's hard enough for me to fit into pants, so I just train for powerlifting, but still, it's really hard for me to do that. And if you were to just train for hypertrophy and not strength, it'd be a little less fatiguing. But that being said, that's not the workout split that I prefer to use. I actually use a workout split that more closely resembles a full body workout. And if you told 16-year-old me that, I don't know if he would have believed you, just because I used to really think that full body training was wimpy almost, I would kind of describe it. Like when I pictured a full body training, I'm picturing like a group fitness class where you're doing cheesy exercises like a squat to a shoulder press. And it's like, I mean, yeah, that's good exercise and activity, but it's not for hypertrophy. It's not for muscle growth. But really the reason I do it, it's technically a full body exercise because I'm doing lots of different exercises across my muscle groups. But the reason I do that is so that I can hit them more frequently throughout the week while not having one exercise fatigue another exercise. So a very common, exercise I have programmed, like every Monday, I'll do deadlifts, and then I'll do bench press, and then I'll do lat pull downs. Those are completely different exercises from each other, but the advantage to that is that I then have hit a certain level of frequency on my legs and my chest and my back, and then I can go in the next couple of days and continue to hit that frequency. But then I can go as hard as I possibly can on the deadlift, and then go to my bench press, and my glutes and my hamstrings are tired, but that doesn't affect my bench press. I go as hard as I can on my bench press, and then I go to lat pull downs, and again, that doesn't affect my strength on my lat pull downs. So I actually do kind of adopt a full body workout. It's something I would recommend it. Obviously, I enjoy it, but another reason of that is because I don't usually train 6 days a week. I train 4 or 5 days a week. But it all really depends. It all really, really, really depends. And again, this is where getting a coach, or at the very least finding a written out workout program, perhaps for free on the internet, and seeing if it lines up with your schedule and you like it. One thing that I don't recommend for the sake of hypertrophy is one thing that you'll commonly see is just incredible amounts of volume. I think like kind of Arnold Schwarzenegger popularized this. And the thing about Arnold is that he was taking anabolics. And in a nutshell, the function of an anabolic steroid is that it helps you recover better and faster and bigger, helps you grow. And so he was able to kind of do that crazy high amounts of volume that would definitely not be ideal for someone who is a natural lifter like me and presumably many of the other people I'm speaking to, because of the anabolics that he was using. So I've seen, interviews with Arnold Schwarzenegger where he talks about how he trains his chest, and he says, you start with the flat barbell bench press, and then you go to the incline barbell bench press, and then you do the incline dumbbell bench press, and then you do the dips for your lower pecs, and then you go and do the chest flies for your striations. And frankly, the fact that he thinks that chest flies are what cause muscle striations kind of tells you that he's passionate about what he did. He worked really hard at it. He enjoyed it, and that's why he made great progress. But he doesn't actually really know much about the science of why these things work. Now, just when you do that much, you're kind of passing the point of the fatigue that you can recover from. And especially if you're doing all those exercises in the same workout, you're going to get to a point where you're so tired from your previous ones that you can't even really perform well and get the stimulus that you could on your other days, which is why I prefer to do sort of the full body exercises, to where, say I want to do my bench press and my shoulder press. I wanted to both be as strong as possible so I can get a great stimulus on my chest and on my shoulders. But then if I were to do them in a push workout on the same day, I might be more fatigued and couldn't get quite as good of a stimulus on those things. The last workout split that I will talk about is the bro split. This is actually one that I employed when I first started lifting, because many people just don't know better. You don't understand. But the thing I will say about it is back to how I've just said, I trained really hard for a long time. When I first started lifting, I was doing the bro split, which is not definitely not recommended for proper muscular hypertrophy, but I gave it a lot of energy. I tried to eat a lot of protein and worked really hard and was really consistent, so it did something for me. But what the bro split is it's that same hitting each muscle group once a week. So it's commonly a Monday through Friday plan. Monday is chest and triceps. Tuesday is back and biceps. Wednesday is legs. And then Thursday is arms. And Friday is shoulders. This is a typical bro split. The way I did it actually was Monday was chest and tricep. Tuesday was back and bicep. Wednesday was leg day. Thursday was shoulder day. And then Friday was ab day. I did sports. I did gymnastics. I did cross country and all those things. We did ab workouts. They were very high rep ab workouts that were drawn out for several minutes, definitely training for endurance and things. But that's what my coaches and everything said was important for your abs. So it's just what I knew and how I trained my abs. And I'd take one day in the morning when I did my workout, and it'd just be a big long ab workout. So I was just hitting each muscle group once each week. Another big flaw that I had in my workout program when I was young is I didn't understand rest time requirements. Now, if you are pushing yourself properly, it's reasonable to be very tired and fatigued. You need a couple minutes to recover in between your sets. When I first started lifting weights, when I was 15 years old, I thought that I was in better shape and better at lifting weights because if I didn't have to take very long on my rest. So I would actually do a set, say a bench press, and then I would set a timer on my watch for 60 seconds. And after 60 seconds, I would go right back to it and do more bench press. And what I realize now is that because I was not prioritizing my rest time, I was not able to work as hard as I could have in the other sets because I was fatigued and I was, it's almost like kind of bordering the endurance training, right? And when we give our muscles time to clear out some of the metabolites, they're a little less sore. They're able to create more energy, replenish ATP and things like that we've used. We're able to perform stronger in the sets that we do. So rest time is very important. Frequency, I've kind of mentioned a couple times with these splits. General guideline is to hit each muscle group twice a week. You'll see lots of perspectives on how many working sets per week are optimal. And I've just never really been able to reconcile myself with them just because almost every single one of them is that you need to do 15 to 20 sets per week for muscle growth. And to me, that's just always been too much. I don't have the time and the energy to do 20 sets for my chest and my back or my upper back and my lats and my legs and my glutes and my arms and my shoulders and my everything. That's a lot of sets that I just don't have the time for. The way that you can kind of reconcile that is that is strict hypertrophy training. That's the only thing you're training for is hypertrophy. So again, you're probably using lower weight, slower tempo, focusing on that stretch to grow the muscle. And I think most people, it's very common. You don't just want to get big. You want to get big and strong. That's a term called power building, combining the word powerlifting and bodybuilding. I think power building is very common. People just want to get strong and they want to get big. They don't just want to be a high-level powerlifter. They don't just want to be a high-level bodybuilder. They just want to be jacked and strong. Of course, there are people that do have one preference one way or the other, but I think it's very common to want to do a little bit of both, and it's healthy to want to do a little bit of both. And so with the split that I use, it kind of incorporates both of those exercises or both of those goals. Now, in closing, I did want to talk a little bit about weight loss medications. It's something that I thought that I should kind of discuss before we do end this podcast episode, just because we were talking about manipulating body composition. How do I feel about the use of weight loss medications? What do they do? Do they work? Here's the thing. I think that if somebody was trying to, there have been accounts even of people who are trying to sell a detox tea, or they're trying to sell their workout program, and then it comes out of the weeds that they, stay skinny, or maybe they had a personal weight loss transformation themselves and they used weight loss medications to achieve it. But then, of course, they're selling to other people that they did it with whatever product they're selling. That, of course, is very dishonest, manipulative. In that case, I think that is pretty unhealthy, rude, manipulative, deceitful, whatever you will, to take weight loss medication in that regard. However, weight loss medication, I think for many people can be a great tool. Now, again, I've talked in this episode about the sort of very aggressive gym people who kind of, you're fat because you're lazy and you don't work hard enough. For many people, and as I've tried to emphasize in this episode, manipulating your body composition is simply about health, about your ability to go into your old age without getting sick, with being able to move around on your own. Of course, there are bodybuilding related goals, physique, get a good looking six-pack related goals to it. I, of course, pursue those goals as well. Like, there's something that's important to me, but I think for somebody who has genuinely struggled with obesity their entire life, somebody who perhaps was raised in an environment where they didn't learn or develop habits around, healthy eating or exercise. And I think a lot of people know that they ought to be healthier and lose a little bit of weight, but a lot of people struggle with it. And so things like Ozempic and tirzepatide and semaglutide, these weight loss medications, I think are pretty valuable for people like that, because it doesn't mean you're lazy because you're overweight. A lot of people are very successful, very hardworking. They are wonderful mothers and fathers and husbands and wives, great workers. They are very knowledgeable and skilled in whatever their profession might be, but they're just overweight because they don't have the habits in place to keep their weight under control. And that's just simply how it goes. In those cases, I've heard wonderful anecdotes about the use of these weight loss medications. For a lot of people, it just they're not hungry as often. They just aren't thinking about food as often. They eat less and they can lose weight. Now, these weight loss medications are not magic. You can't just think that you can, take this injection of a weight loss medication and change absolutely nothing about your diet and you're magically going to lose weight. But it can sometimes be that little extra push that somebody needs to get over the edge and start making really good habits and lifestyle choices. The way most of these weight loss medications work is that they replicate a compound found in our body called GLP-1. You perhaps have heard of that. That is glucagon-like peptide, number one. And when they replicate the function of glucagon-like peptide, they pretty much increase your satiety signals. They talk to your brain and help you release hormones that signal to your body that you are full and you do not need to eat. The reason that these were actually invented is because they help trigger your body to release insulin. And so they were originally formulated as medications to help those with type 2 diabetes because they help your body produce a little bit of extra insulin, which is, of course, very valuable for type 2 diabetics. But then what was noticed is that a side effect of this type 2 diabetic medication is weight loss, which in the case of type 2 diabetes is actually very good. You can really get rid of many of the symptoms of your type 2 diabetes if you get your weight under control, assuming that an excess of calories is what triggered your type 2 diabetes. And doctors are allowed to prescribe anything for anything they want. Within their scope of practice, if they did something bad, if they messed up, and if they were being dumb, you could obviously sue them for malpractice. So they're not just going to do dumb things. But if there's this medication that was originally made for type 2 diabetes, but then it's helping people feel satiated and less hungry throughout their day, then you can prescribe it to somebody who wants to lose weight and become healthier to help them not feel as hungry throughout the day. There is, like I've said, a lot of controversy, a lot of people thinking it's cheating, but a lot of people don't care to cheat. Like, you're not an athlete. I'm pretty sure it's banned for, you can't use it for weight class sports, and you can't use it for, I don't know, all these different things. If you're a natural bodybuilder, you can't use it to help lose weight for your bodybuilding show or anything like that. But most people are willing to take a medication to be healthier, to live longer, to stave off chronic disease and have a healthier lifestyle closer to the end of their life. So I think that if it's something you struggle with, of course, I'm not a doctor. I cannot prescribe. I can't really answer many of your questions about how your pancreas and your insulin and your GLP-1 is going to work together. But if someone were to come to me and say, I'm trying to lose weight, should I talk to my doctor about some tirzepatide, semaglutide? I would say yes. I would never look down on somebody for not being disciplined enough because they have to take this weight loss medication to lose weight. I would smile upon it and congratulate them for taking their health seriously so that they can live a healthier life. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. Again, if you'd like to support my mission in creating this podcast, please like, comment, share, subscribe, rate this show. It really does help this content reach more people who may be interested in it. This has been the Science of Sports Performance.